I had been planning this camping trip for months, and by the time I packed my gear into the back of my old pickup truck, I felt a mix of excitement and relief. I needed the isolation, the silence of the woods, away from people, phones, and everything that made my life feel heavy. My plan was simple: drive deep into the national forest, find a spot far from the trails, set up camp, and spend 3 days alone in the wilderness. I didn't want comfort, I wanted the raw, unfiltered forest. I wanted to test myself. I drove most of the afternoon, watching the trees thicken and the roads narrow, the air growing cooler and heavier as I climbed into higher terrain. By late afternoon, the sun was dropping behind the ridges, throwing long shadows across the forest floor, and I realized I had to find my spot soon. I didn't want to set up camp in the dark, but I also didn't want to miss the perfect isolation. Eventually, I spotted a clearing that looked untouched, a small plateau surrounded by thick pine and oak. The ground was uneven but manageable, covered in dry leaves and pine needles. It was far enough from the road that no one would see me, and yet it had a small stream nearby, a thin ribbon of water glinting in the fading light. I parked, unloaded my gear, and started setting up. The tent went up slowly, my hands stiff from the cold and sweat from the effort. I hammered in the stakes and laid out my sleeping bag, my backpack, and the small stove I had brought. Everything had to be precise because I was alone, and mistakes could turn small problems into big ones. After setting up, I built a small fire pit using stones from the surrounding area. I collected dry wood, careful to choose branches that were brittle and would catch quickly. By the time I had a small fire crackling, the sun had disappeared completely, leaving the forest bathed in deep blues and blacks. I cooked a simple meal of beans and rice over the fire and ate while staring into the woods. The forest felt alive in a way I had never noticed before. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a twig seemed amplified. At first it was peaceful. I enjoyed the darkness, the smell of smoke mixing with pine, and the faint sound of the stream nearby. But as the night deepened, a sense of unease settled in. I tried to rationalize it. There were deer, maybe raccoons, possibly coyotes, but nothing more. Still, the sound of footsteps, or what I thought were footsteps, echoed in my mind. I kept reminding myself that I was alone and responsible for my own safety. I had a knife in my pocket, and the fire gave me a sense of control. But control felt thinner the longer I sat there. I decided to climb into my tent, zipped up fully, and tried to sleep. The forest noises were relentless. Owls, the occasional rustle, and something that sounded like heavy breathing or dragging, just outside the range of my firelight. I stared at the tent wall, imagining shapes in the darkness, and eventually, exhaustion took over. I woke abruptly a few hours later to the sound of cracking wood. My heart jumped and I froze, listening. The noise was close, too close, like someone or something was moving carefully among the trees surrounding my clearing. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, feeling my pulse in my ears. I shone the beam outward and nothing moved. The forest looked peaceful, untouched, but the sound continued sporadically, shifting positions. I could hear it circling. Panic began to creep in. I told myself to stay calm. Most likely it was a deer or a bear, though the latter scared me far more than I wanted to admit. I remembered reading that bears often investigated campsites at night, drawn by food. I had stored my meal in a small bear-proof container a few yards away, but maybe I hadn't done it right. I decided to stay in the tent, keeping the flashlight and knife close. The fire had mostly died down, leaving only glowing embers. I could hear the forest clearly now. The soft murmur of the stream, leaves shuffling, a distant branch snapping under what I imagined were heavy footsteps. Hours passed, each one stretching like a lifetime. I fought the urge to check outside. At one point I thought I saw a shadow move across the tent wall. I held my breath, listening. My flashlight was dead, and I realized I had forgotten extra batteries. I cursed myself quietly, feeling the first real wave of fear. I felt completely vulnerable, every part of my body alert and tensed. The forest felt impossibly close, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. Eventually, I managed to drift off, though fitfully. I woke again, this time to a loud, sharp snapping of a large branch. It sounded almost like it was stepping right on my fire pit stones. I bolted upright, heart hammering, and shone the flashlight in the direction of the sound. I saw movement, something dark and tall moving through the trees. My rational mind told me it was a deer, but the way it moved didn't feel right. It was deliberate, slow, almost calculating. I spent the rest of the night in the tent, flashlight in hand, fire long gone, and waited for the first light. I didn't sleep again until the sun rose, and even then I was shaking. When morning came, I cautiously unzipped the tent and scanned the clearing. Nothing was out of place except my fire pit, which had been disturbed slightly, and the bear-proof container which had been nudged. I sighed with relief, but knew I couldn't linger here. I decided to pack up quickly, but as I lifted my backpack, I heard a faint growl. Not loud, not menacing in volume, but unmistakable. I froze, scanning the edges of the clearing. Nothing appeared, but the growl came again, this time closer. My mind raced. It was probably a bear checking for food, and I had been careless. I knew better now. I should have hiked to a more visible area, kept all scents contained, and remained alert. I grabbed the bear spray I had brought, backed into the truck, and started the engine. I didn't want to tempt fate. As I drove down the narrow dirt road, I felt eyes on me, though I never saw anything. The forest seemed alive with unseen presence, and I was glad to leave. The rest of the day I drove back toward civilization, stopping only when I reached a small town. My hands were still shaking, my stomach tight with tension. I had survived, but I realized how small and vulnerable a human is in the forest, when careful planning meets raw, unpredictable nature. That night I slept in a motel, safe, with walls, doors, and locks, thinking about the previous night. I knew I would go back to the forest someday, but not alone. The wilderness had reminded me that fear isn't always something supernatural. It's the silence, the unpredictability, the feeling that you are being watched and alone, and you have nothing but yourself to rely on. I'd always liked camping, not the flashy, overcrowded state parks with people playing music and leaving trash everywhere, but the deep, empty woods where the only sounds were the wind in the trees, the occasional bird, and the slow drip of a creek. I had been planning this trip for months, studying maps, checking weather reports, and choosing a spot far from roads, far from cell service, a place that promised real isolation. My plan was simple: 3 nights in the wilderness alone with nothing but my backpack, my tent, and a small supply of food. I wanted to test myself, to see how far I could push my limits, and I had done enough solo trips before to think I could handle it. But this trip ended up being different, far different. I started early in the morning, driving a small, rugged SUV along a dirt road that soon narrowed into a rocky path. The last mile required 4-wheel drive, and I crawled over rocks and through mud, the tires slipping and grinding until finally I reached a small clearing I had picked from satellite images. It was perfect. No litter, no sign of people except faint tracks of animals. I parked and unloaded my gear, feeling the familiar thrill of stepping into true solitude. The first day passed slowly. I hiked to explore the surrounding woods, taking note of water sources and marking potential camping spots. The forest was thick, a mix of tall pine and oak, the underbrush sparse enough to walk through without much trouble. Birds called overhead, and I caught glimpses of deer and squirrels. I set my tent near a small ridge overlooking a shallow stream, a spot that would give me some visibility in case anything approached, and also high enough to avoid any sudden flooding. I gathered firewood, arranging a small pile carefully, and started to filter water from the stream for drinking. By late afternoon, the sun was low and the forest started to change. Shadows stretching, sound shifting, everything growing sharper, more defined. Night fell quickly. I had built a modest fire and cooked a small meal of rice and canned beans. Sitting by the flames, I felt a familiar sense of peace. The forest was alive but not threatening, and the night sky was clear, showing a scattering of stars I rarely saw in the city. I put my flashlight nearby, the knife on my belt, my backpack close to hand. I slept that night in the tent with the zipper only half closed, trusting in the isolation and the quiet, unaware of what would happen. The second day was when the feeling of unease began. I hiked further, following a faint game trail that led deeper into the woods. The trail narrowed, the trees closer together, the ground littered with fallen branches and leaves. Around midday, I noticed something unusual. Footprints. Not human, at least not recent, but large, perhaps from a deer or a wild dog. Though some were oddly shaped. I took pictures, unsure, and kept going. By late afternoon, the sky darkened unexpectedly. Clouds rolling in fast, and I decided to head back. On the way, I noticed the trail splitting into several smaller paths, none of which I had marked on my map. I began to feel disoriented, my sense of direction slipping. Back at camp, I checked my supplies, filtered more water, and sat by the fire, trying to shake off the feeling that something was off. The forest at night had a way of twisting sounds. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, and every noise made me tense. I kept my flashlight close and my knife on my lap, though I told myself it was just my imagination. Still, there was an edge to the night I hadn't felt before. The third day, and what turned out to be the start of true trouble, began with fog. Thick, damp, clinging to the trees and ground, it reduced visibility to a few meters. I packed my tent and started hiking along the ridge, planning to follow the stream to a lower area I had scouted. I had decided to extend my hike, thinking the fog would lift by midday. But it didn't. As I moved, the fog muffled my sounds, and I realized I could no longer hear the stream. I had lost it. My map showed I was close, but the terrain was deceptive, slopes hidden under fallen leaves and moss. My steps became cautious, deliberate, scanning every footfall. Around midday, I saw it. The first real sign that I was not alone in these woods. A small tree had been broken, cut almost cleanly, like someone had tried to make a crude marker. My stomach turned. This wasn't natural. It didn't match the occasional marks left by deer or animals. My mind raced through the possibilities: other campers, hunters, someone living off the grid. I had to assume the worst, a human. I decided to stay calm. I marked my position, noted landmarks, and tried to get back on track. Hours passed, the fog thickened, and then I saw more signs. Footprints larger than any deer, deep and deliberate. Some were fresh, mud still clinging to the edges. I realized I had been followed, or at least that someone had passed through here recently, close enough that they might still be around. My heart pounded, but I tried to rationalize. These were woods, I was alone. Maybe the person had left hours ago. Still, my pace quickened. By late afternoon, I found myself at a small clearing I hadn't seen before. It was unsettlingly tidy, almost as if someone had been living here. There were remnants of a fire, a crude shelter made from branches and a tarp. I checked around but found nothing else. The air was damp, smelled faintly of smoke. My mind screamed at me to leave, but I realized I didn't know which way was safe. I started moving in a direction I thought led back to my original camp. But soon the fog became heavier, the forest darker. Night fell without mercy. I hadn't packed enough light, and my headlamp's battery was weak. I knew I couldn't hike in the dark safely. My only option was to find a sheltered spot and wait for morning. I found a small depression under a cluster of trees, cleared the leaves, and settled down. I tried to start a small fire, but the wood was damp from the fog. I huddled in my jacket, knife in hand, listening. Every rustle of leaves sounded deliberate, like someone walking slowly, testing. My mind played tricks, shadows morphing into figures, branches snapping like footsteps. Sleep was impossible. Hours passed. The temperature dropped sharply. I heard distant sounds, the crunch of leaves, the faint scraping of something heavy moving through the underbrush. I had no idea if it was an animal, a person, or just my imagination. But I stayed still, barely breathing. I kept my knife close in my backpack position so I could grab it quickly. I told myself to remain calm, to think logically, but the isolation gnawed at me. Finally, just before dawn, the fog began to lift. The light filtered weakly through the trees, showing the forest in muted gray and green. I decided I had to move. I couldn't stay here. I picked a direction based on the sun and my map, hoping it would lead back to the ridge and eventually my camp. Every step was careful, deliberate. My eyes scanned constantly for footprints, signs of movement, anything that might indicate someone was following. I stumbled upon the stream first. Relief washed over me. Following it downstream, I recognized landmarks. A large boulder, a fallen tree bridging the creek, familiar undergrowth. My camp was close. The fog had lifted enough that I could see it in the distance, and I ran the last few hundred meters, adrenaline pushing me forward. I arrived at the tent to find it exactly as I left it, nothing disturbed. My firewood was damp, but otherwise nothing was missing or moved. I allowed myself a cautious sense of relief. I packed up quickly, deciding not to stay another night. The unease hadn't left me. I hiked back to the SUV, careful to note every turn, every landmark. By mid-morning, I was back on the dirt road, the car coming into view. The engine roared to life, and the feeling of safety returned incrementally with every mile. Driving away, I looked back at the forest. It seemed peaceful now, innocent even, but I knew better. Something had been there. Maybe it was a hunter. Maybe someone living off the grid, or maybe just a person willing to stalk the woods. I didn't want to know for sure. That day, back home, I unpacked my gear, cleaned my equipment, and tried to shake the memory. But the quiet, the footprints, the fog, the feeling of being followed stayed with me. It had been a simple camping trip at first, a chance to test myself and enjoy the solitude. But it had turned into something else entirely. A reminder that the wilderness, while beautiful, could also be unforgiving and unpredictable. I had survived, yes, and that survival left me more alert, more aware, and far more respectful of the woods than I had ever been. From that trip on, I didn't take isolation for granted. I never camped alone in deep, untracked woods again without leaving detailed plans with someone, always carrying extra light, extra food, extra batteries, and always checking in when possible. The memory of those footsteps, the makeshift shelter, and the foggy night lingered, a constant warning. The woods are not empty, and sometimes the danger isn't in the wild animals. It's in the quiet presence of another human. I had been planning the trip for months. It wasn't a complicated plan. I just needed a few days away from the city, away from the constant noise, traffic, and fluorescent lights. I had bought a cheap tent, a sleeping bag, a small portable stove, and packed as many supplies as I could manage by myself. My goal was simple: to find a remote campsite somewhere deep enough into the forest that I would be alone, and spend 3 nights completely cut off from everything else. I wanted silence, solitude, and the kind of isolation that makes you aware of your own breathing. I never thought I would regret it. The forest I chose wasn't famous or marked on many maps. It was one of those stretches of wilderness that locals knew, but outsiders rarely ventured into. It was dense, dark, and full of old-growth trees whose branches were thick and tangled. The drive-in was long, winding, and eventually led to a dirt path barely wide enough for my car. I parked at the edge where the path ended and the trees began in earnest, and I felt the first real sense of distance from civilization. The air smelled different here, heavier, earthy, damp, with the faint tang of moss and rotting leaves. It was intoxicating at first. I set my pack down and stared into the forest, trying to imagine where I would set up camp. I wanted a spot far from any trail or road, one where no one could stumble across me by accident. I walked for about an hour, following a narrow, almost invisible trail made by animals. The forest was quiet except for occasional bird calls and the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Every so often I would pause and listen, letting my eyes adjust to the shadows. Eventually I found a small clearing just wide enough for my tent and a small fire pit. There was a large fallen log nearby that I could use to sit on, and the ground was mostly flat, covered with dry pine needles. It felt perfect. Setting up camp took longer than I expected. I pitched the tent, hammered the stakes into the ground, and unpacked my stove and supplies. I built a small fire pit from stones I found around the clearing and gathered some dry wood. The sun was low in the sky by the time I finished, casting long shadows across the trees. I lit a small fire and sat down, feeling the warmth and comfort of the flames. I made a simple meal, canned beans and some bread, and ate slowly, watching the fire crackle. The forest around me was alive with subtle noises. The creaking of branches, the skittering of rodents, the distant cry of an owl. It was relaxing, almost hypnotic. Night fell quickly, as it always does in a dense forest. The darkness was absolute, swallowing everything beyond the small circle of firelight. I sat quietly for a long time, listening to the night. That's when I noticed the first unsettling thing. A branch snapped just outside the circle of light. It wasn't the wind. The air was still. It was sharp, deliberate. I froze, trying to tell if it was an animal, but the sound didn't repeat. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, and went to my tent to sleep. Sleeping was uncomfortable. The ground was uneven despite my careful selection, and I could hear every subtle sound of the forest. Branches rubbing together, the soft patter of falling leaves, the faint rush of a distant stream. It all sounded louder than it should have. I had a flashlight and a small knife, and I kept them within reach, but I didn't feel immediately threatened. Just watched. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of movement near my camp. It was subtle at first, just a faint rustling, but it grew louder. I lay still, heart hammering, trying to pinpoint the source. Something or someone was moving in the forest around me. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the clearing, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The beam hit trees, bushes, the forest floor, but no figure, no shadow. Just movement in the underbrush, something too heavy to be a small animal. I gripped my knife tighter, and for the first time I felt real fear. Hours passed like that, each small sound making me tense. I didn't sleep again that night. I stayed awake, sitting by the fire, keeping the light small but steady. When morning came, I felt exhausted, almost as if I had aged a decade overnight. The forest looked peaceful in daylight, the sun filtering through the leaves, the air fresh and cool. I told myself it had been nothing, probably a deer or a raccoon, but I knew something had been moving around my camp. The next day I explored the surrounding area, hoping to find a stream or another clearing where I could feel safer. I followed a narrow creek, walking slowly, scanning for any sign of people or anything else. The forest felt heavier than the day before. Every broken branch, every footprint in the mud made me jump. I found no one, no obvious signs of human activity. But I did find something else, a series of footprints half hidden in the mud near the creek. They were too large to be a deer, and the spacing suggested a human. I followed them cautiously, moving slowly, but they disappeared into the forest. I felt a knot of fear tighten in my stomach. Whoever or whatever had left those prints had been close. I returned to my camp and spent the evening reinforcing my fire pit and stacking wood. I made sure my knife and flashlight were ready. I didn't sleep well again. Each snap, each rustle made my heart leap. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I stayed near the fire, too anxious to rest. On the third day, I made a decision to hike back toward the car. I told myself it wasn't cowardice, I just wanted to get out of the forest safely. I packed my things quickly, making sure nothing was left behind, and began the trek back. The trail was harder to follow than I remembered. Trees and underbrush had shifted slightly, or maybe I had simply lost my bearings. I realized I had been so focused on the clearing that I hadn't paid attention to landmarks. Panic started to creep in as I realized I might not find the path easily. I tried to stay calm, marking trees with small scratches so I could retrace my steps. The sun was high, but the forest canopy made it feel dim and oppressive. Then I heard it, a branch snapping behind me. I froze, holding my breath, trying to listen. It came again, closer this time. I started moving faster, my heart racing. Then the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, following me. Not random, not animal. Someone was behind me, moving through the forest, keeping distance but keeping pace. I broke into a run, dodging trees and roots, trying to keep the path straight. My backpack weighed me down, but I couldn't stop. The footsteps followed. I dared not look back, fearing what I might see. The forest seemed endless, every tree the same as the last, every shadow hiding something. I ran for what felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I refused to stop. Finally, I spotted the edge of the forest, the thin strip of road where I had parked. Relief flooded me, but I kept running until I was sure I had cleared the tree line. I didn't stop until I reached my car, slamming the doors shut and locking them. I fumbled for my keys, started the engine, and drove without looking back. When I got home, exhausted and shaking, I unpacked my supplies and tried to make sense of what had happened. The forest had seemed safe during the day, peaceful and quiet, but at night it had been something else entirely. Something patient, something human, something waiting. I never went back. I never camped alone again. Weeks later, I researched local reports of missing hikers and campers in the area. There were a few cases that never made national news. Some were never found. Some were discovered days later, far from where they had been last seen, with no clear explanation. The thought that someone might have been following me those nights, observing me from the shadows, lingered in my mind. I realized how easily someone could be out there, hiding, patient, waiting for the right moment. The forest wasn't haunted or magical. It was real, alive, and dangerous, not because of ghosts, but because people, or the unknown, could be out there watching. I never went back. I never camped alone again. And every time I hear a snap or rustle in the woods, even in a city park, I remember that week and I feel that same knot of fear tighten in my stomach. The forest doesn't forgive. It doesn't care. And sometimes it hides things you'd rather never encounter. I had always liked the idea of being alone in the woods. There was something about the silence, the way the wind brushed through the leaves and the smell of damp earth mixed with pine sap that felt like freedom. I had grown up camping with my family, always surrounded by voices, laughter, and the occasional scolding from my parents when we weren't careful with the fire. But this trip was different. I was alone, carrying a backpack with the bare essentials, trying to get away from everything for a few days. I wanted the woods to be mine, unshared, uncontaminated by other people. I didn't know then that the woods had a way of showing who was serious about being alone and who was just pretending. I started early in the morning, leaving my car at a small parking area off a rarely traveled road. My plan was to follow an old trail I'd read about in a forum, a trail that was supposedly mostly abandoned, leading to a small clearing near a stream. People had said the stream ran year-round and that the area was quiet enough that you could hear yourself breathe. I had my map, a compass, and a flashlight in case I got delayed. I had food, a small stove, a tent, and a sleeping bag. I was over-prepared in some ways and under-prepared in others. The first few hours were easy. The trail was faint, but footprints and tire tracks told me it had been used at least occasionally. The sun was high enough that the forest was bright and warm, and the air smelled like wet moss. I stopped once to take a small snack and refill my water bottle at a shallow part of the stream I passed. I could hear birds, the occasional woodpecker, and the distant hum of insects. Everything felt normal, almost too normal, like the woods were letting me in on a secret. By late afternoon, I was getting closer to the clearing. I could hear the stream better now, rushing over rocks and making a soft, constant murmur. I found a spot that looked like it had been used as a campsite before. The ground was flattened in a wide circle, and there were remnants of a fire pit, mostly stones in a rough circle, blackened earth in the center, and a few charred pieces of wood. I decided this was where I would set up camp. I worked quickly, pitching the tent and arranging my sleeping area. I set the stove up nearby, making sure it was far enough from the tent to be safe but close enough that I could use it without trouble. I had canned food and some dried jerky, and I made a simple meal while sitting on a log by the stream. The sun was lowering in the sky, sending shadows through the trees, long and dark, moving as if they had a life of their own. I told myself it was just the wind, just the late afternoon stretching out over the forest. The first night was uneventful. I slept lightly, waking now and then to the sounds of the forest. A raccoon rummaged nearby at one point, and I could hear something heavier moving through the trees a little further away. I had read that deer, bears, or coyotes could wander through at night. I didn't panic. I had my flashlight and my small knife, and I was cautious but not afraid. I fell back asleep after a while, and the morning came with the sun filtering through the leaves, warming the tent slowly. The second day, I decided to explore. I wanted to see more of the trail, maybe find higher ground and get a better sense of the area. I hiked upstream along the stream, moving carefully over rocks and fallen branches. The trail became less obvious, more overgrown. Thorny bushes caught at my clothes, and I had to push through small saplings. The further I went, the quieter it got. Not silent exactly, but the birds and insects seemed to thin out, leaving just the sound of my own movement and the water rushing nearby. That night, things started to feel off. I had returned to my campsite, cooked dinner, and was settling into my tent when I heard it, a rustling that didn't sound like the wind. At first I ignored it, assuming it was an animal. But the noise was different, deliberate. It wasn't random like a raccoon pawing through leaves or a deer stepping on twigs. It was heavier, slower, methodical. My stomach clenched and I felt a cold sense of awareness. I could hear the snap of twigs, the crunch of leaves. Something was moving closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. I called out once, my voice small and hoarse, but no reply came. The rustling stopped. I listened. The forest was quiet again, too quiet. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I went back into the tent, locking the flap and trying to calm myself. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was a deer, maybe a coyote, moving through the underbrush. I lay down and tried to sleep, but I was alert. Every sound made me tense. Every shadow and the dim light of the moon outside made my imagination race. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something brushing against the tent. It was soft, deliberate. I froze, holding my breath. The noise continued for a few seconds, then stopped. I didn't move. My mind ran through possibilities. Bear? Maybe, but bears usually make a lot of noise. Human? That thought made my stomach drop. I had told no one exactly where I was going. No one had the exact coordinates of this trail. But the woods were public and people did wander off trail. Some of them were harmless, some of them weren't. I had read enough survival stories to know the difference between cautious and panicked. I stayed perfectly still, listening, trying to detect anything unusual. Eventually, the sound stopped. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat in my tent, flashlight off, ears straining, until the first light of dawn came through the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of someone or something moving around the edge of the clearing. The next day, I packed a small day pack and decided to hike a little further, staying close to the stream. I told myself moving would help, that staying put made me an easy target if someone really was out there. I kept my knife accessible and my flashlight in my hand. The trail disappeared entirely at some points. I had to push through thick brush and my clothes were scratched and stained with sap and dirt. But I made it further upstream and eventually found a natural clearing. A wide flat area with rocks and some fallen logs. I sat for a while, drinking water and catching my breath. As I rested, I noticed something unusual. Tracks, footprints. Not animal footprints, but human. They were large, booted prints in the soft earth near the stream. I froze. They weren't fresh, but not old either. They led in my direction. I traced them back as far as I could see, then back toward the woods behind me. The realization hit me hard. Someone had been here recently and had passed near my campsite. My stomach twisted. I had felt like someone was there the night before. Maybe I wasn't imagining it. I returned to the campsite quickly, checking the fire pit and the surrounding area. Nothing was different. No sign anyone had been in my immediate spot overnight, but the tracks continued around the edge of the clearing. I spent the rest of the day on edge, moving only within sight of the stream, keeping my knife ready, keeping my flashlight on standby. I tried to keep my mind busy, arranging firewood, cleaning my gear, even washing in the stream while keeping my eyes on the trees. Every crack, every snap of a twig made me tense. That night I slept lightly, but I couldn't ignore the noises. Around midnight I heard it again. The slow, deliberate rustling from the edge of the clearing. This time I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek. The beam caught movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. I could see nothing else. I shined the light in that direction, moving it slowly, trying to catch something concrete. Nothing. But the movement didn't stop entirely. I could hear it, someone walking carefully, deliberately, as if they knew I was inside the tent. Fear gripped me in a way I hadn't felt before. Not panic exactly, but a cold, focused awareness that I was not alone. I considered leaving immediately, but the darkness and the dense woods made movement risky. I didn't want to stumble, break a leg, or make a sound. I stayed in the tent, breathing shallowly, listening, waiting. The rustling moved along the edge of the clearing, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. I felt like I could hear the person thinking, moving with purpose. By the time the sky began to lighten, the noise stopped. I didn't wait any longer. I packed my gear as quickly and quietly as I could, throwing everything into my backpack and slinging it on my shoulders. I moved along the trail toward the parking area, keeping to the shadows, moving as silently as possible. I traced the footprints back, keeping a careful eye on the underbrush, but I never saw anyone. It took hours, but eventually, I emerged from the dense trees into a familiar clearing. The parking area was empty, my car sitting exactly where I had left it. Relief washed over me in a wave I couldn't stop. I checked the surroundings one last time, got in the car, locked the doors, and drove off without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached a small town a half hour away, where I pulled into a gas station to collect myself. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. A rare break from work and everything else that tied me down. The idea was simple. A solo camping trip deep in the backcountry, somewhere remote where I could be alone with the forest and nothing else. I packed carefully, overpacked maybe, but that was part of the ritual, the preparation, making sure I had everything I could need. Tent, sleeping bag, tarp, stove, food for 2 days, a first aid kit, flashlight, headlamp, backup batteries, a knife, a small hatchet, rope, matches in a waterproof container, water filter, and a few snacks I didn't even really need but brought anyway. I always over-prepared. I drove for hours, taking roads that got narrower and rougher the further I went. Eventually, the asphalt gave way to dirt. The trees pressed in closer on either side, and the air smelled like wet earth and pine. It was quiet in a way that city life never allowed. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of everything else. The wind brushing through the branches, the occasional call of a bird, the rustle of something unseen in the undergrowth. I parked where the road ended and grabbed my pack. My legs felt stiff from sitting so long, but I welcomed the stretch as I stepped into the forest. The first mile of the trail was easy. It was wide, relatively flat, and lined with thick pine. I moved deliberately, taking in the smells, the play of light and shadow across the forest floor. There were old tracks, maybe from hikers, maybe from animals. I didn't think much of it. People left traces everywhere. I reached a fork in the trail, one path leading to a stream I had marked on the map, the other winding deeper into denser woods. I took the one that went deeper. I wanted isolation. By the second hour, the forest thickened. The trees were taller, older, and the undergrowth denser. I had to step carefully over roots and fallen branches. I paused several times to drink water and check my map, but I felt certain I was still on track. The air grew cooler and damper as shadows lengthened, though the sun was still a few hours from setting. I thought about setting up camp early, but I wanted to find the perfect spot, a place hidden, quiet, near water but not too close. Flat ground, sheltered from wind. I found it by mid-afternoon. A small clearing, surrounded by pines and oaks with soft, firm soil, and a slight slope that led down to a stream trickling nearby. The sound of the water was subtle, soothing. I set up my tent carefully, pounding stakes into the ground, threading poles through fabric loops, making sure it was secure. I laid out my sleeping bag inside, unpacked some food, and organized my small campsite meticulously. As I sat on a flat rock by the stream, sipping water and munching on trail mix, I felt a sense of satisfaction. Alone, away from everything, surrounded by nature. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. Birds moved quietly overhead and squirrels chased each other along branches. The forest seemed alive but content, as if it barely noticed me. The sun was beginning to dip when I gathered wood for a fire. I had brought a small stove, but nothing compares to the smell and sound of an open flame in the wild. I found dry sticks and branches, arranging them carefully, and soon had a fire crackling. The warmth felt comforting as shadows stretched long across the clearing. I sat, eating a simple dinner, and let the forest noises fill the space around me. That night after dark, I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped up the tent, and turned on my headlamp briefly to organize some gear. The wind rustled outside, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. I turned it off and let the darkness take over. I listened, as I always did, for the noises of the night. Small animals moving through undergrowth, birds calling to each other, the stream bubbling quietly. Sleep came fitfully. I woke more than once to the sound of something moving outside the tent. Small branches snapping, leaves crunching, and at one point a heavier sound like something large stepping carefully on the ground. I reminded myself it was probably a deer or another animal. Predators are rare here, and even if there were one, it would likely avoid humans. Still, my heart beat faster each time. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a different sound, a faint, irregular scraping. I froze, straining to hear. It wasn't the wind or a branch falling. It was deliberate, slow, methodical, coming from the tree line just beyond the firelight I had left burning earlier. I stayed still, breathing slowly, trying to convince myself it was a raccoon or a fox. But the sound continued, closer now. Something was moving carefully, testing, sniffing, scratching. I debated whether to investigate. My gut said no, but curiosity gnawed at me. I reached for my flashlight, shining it outside the tent. The beam caught nothing at first, just shadows and the faint outline of trees. Then I noticed movement. Something crouched, hunched over, moving from tree to tree, keeping to the dark edges of the clearing. I couldn't make out details, but it was too big to be a fox or raccoon. Fear set in. I remembered every piece of advice about staying calm, making noise, being prepared. I grabbed my knife, small but heavy, and kept my headlamp off, thinking about my options. There was no way I could outrun something if it was dangerous, and I had no shelter but this flimsy tent. My mind raced through possibilities. It could be a bear, but bears usually leave clear signs, paw prints, scat, and avoid humans. Could it be a person? The thought made my stomach twist. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere at this hour? I stayed still for what felt like an eternity, listening. The scraping stopped. I held my breath. Then silence, only the stream's faint babble and the wind. I forced myself to calm down, reminding myself I was probably imagining things. Eventually, exhaustion won over fear, and I drifted back to an uneasy sleep, knife within reach. I woke at first light to a clear, cool morning. The forest looked entirely ordinary, the way it always did in daylight. Sunlight filtered through the trees. Birds sang and squirrels darted among branches. I checked the perimeter. My fire had burned low, and the clearing showed no footprints except mine. Nothing seemed disturbed. Part of me felt foolish, but part of me knew something had been there. After breakfast, I packed up and decided to explore the stream. The trail alongside it led to a small waterfall and a pool. I followed it upstream, slipping over wet rocks, careful not to fall. The water was clear, the sound of the waterfall calming. I paused to drink some filtered water, letting the cool morning air fill my lungs. I noticed broken branches on the far bank, faint tracks, but they didn't resemble any animal I knew. Human, possibly. I frowned, uneasy. Whoever or whatever had been here hadn't made themselves known during the day. I hiked back to my campsite, heart still racing but determination setting in. I had to finish my trip. I needed to see it through. I spent the day hiking nearby trails, observing the forest, making sure I left markers of my route. Every sound made me jump. The snapping of twigs, rustling leaves, the sudden splash of water. But nothing appeared to pursue me. That night I was more prepared. I set a perimeter with small bells tied to branches. Primitive, but enough to alert me if something large entered my immediate space. I kept my fire burning brighter than before and my flashlight charged. When night fell, I crawled into my tent with my knife, sleeping bag, and hatchet within arm's reach. I listened, eyes wide open in the darkness, for hours. At around midnight, the sound returned. Scraping, deliberate, cautious, I froze. Then a branch snapped much closer. I shined my flashlight outside. Two shapes emerged briefly at the edge of the firelight, crouched, moving. I didn't recognize them as humans or animals. They seemed deliberate, stalking the perimeter, retreating when I pointed the light. My heart pounded. I realized then that I was not alone. Not with wildlife. Something or someone was observing me. I decided I couldn't wait this out. If they were humans, confrontation could be dangerous. If it was an animal, being alert was critical. I grabbed my pack, knife, and flashlight, extinguished the fire, and left a trail marker to disguise my departure. I moved silently, sticking to the shadows of the trees away from the clearing. I planned a route back to the main trail I had come in on, trying not to panic, trying to move efficiently but quietly. Hours later, just before dawn, I reached the road. My legs were aching, my arms scratched by branches, but I felt relief unlike anything I had experienced in years. I got into my car, locked the doors, and sat for several minutes, heart still racing. I drove away slowly, glancing in the rearview mirror. The forest seemed calm, ordinary again, as if nothing had happened. When I got home, I unpacked and washed, trying to calm myself. I thought about calling authorities but had no concrete proof. Just my experience and a gut feeling that someone or something had been tracking me in the woods. I told a few friends what happened. They nodded politely. Some laughed. Some seemed genuinely concerned. None of it mattered. I knew what I had experienced was real. I returned to the forest weeks later during the day with a small friend and a larger group to check the area. We found the same clearing, the same trails, but there were no signs of the shapes I had seen at night. Nothing out of place. The forest had swallowed all evidence. I realized then that I went camping alone that weekend because I needed quiet. I didn't plan it long in advance, didn't even think about where I'd go until the night before. I just threw a few things in the back of my car and drove north until I found a place that looked far enough from everything. It wasn't a campground with picnic tables or marked spots, just a narrow dirt road that wound off the highway, following a line of pines until it opened into a clearing. I could see no one else around, not even an old fire ring or signs that someone had been there before. It looked perfect to me. The air smelled like pine and mud. It had rained the night before and the ground was still damp. Dark patches of earth covered in wet needles that stuck to my boots. I parked near a cluster of thick trees, far enough from the small stream I'd spotted through the brush. I liked the sound of the water. It wasn't loud but steady, like a quiet hiss that never stopped. It made everything else feel still. I unpacked slowly. I set up the tent facing the tree line, not the road because I wanted to forget there was a road at all. I built a small fire ring out of stones, set my sleeping bag and mat inside the tent, and unpacked a small cooler with food. Simple stuff: bread, eggs, canned beans, and a few beers. Nothing fancy. The kind of food you eat when you want to feel the quiet of being away from everyone. I remember how calm everything was at first. Even my heartbeat felt slower out there. I could hear distant birds, but no cars, no voices, not even wind strong enough to move the trees. I spent most of that first afternoon just walking around. The forest was thick but not impossible to move through, mostly pine and birch, spaced out with patches of ferns and fallen logs. I followed the stream upstream for a while and saw that it wound deeper into the woods, maybe from a lake or spring farther in. There were old animal tracks near the mud. Deer, maybe raccoon, something with small claws, but nothing big enough to worry me. I felt good. Tired in a nice way. By the time I got back, the sun had dropped behind the trees, leaving a soft orange light that made everything glow. I built a small fire and sat near it, eating beans straight out of the can, watching the smoke drift upward through the branches. The first night felt long but peaceful. I stayed up until the fire burned down to red coals, then climbed into my tent and listened to the night sounds, the small clicks of insects, the soft splash of water from the stream, the occasional crack of wood expanding in the cooling air. I fell asleep easily. Sometime in the middle of the night I woke up. I didn't know why. The fire was dead by then, and my tent was dark except for a faint glow of moonlight through the thin fabric. I lay still, half asleep, and listened. For a few seconds I didn't hear anything unusual, just the quiet hum of night. Then I realized I couldn't hear the stream anymore. That was strange. It had been loud enough earlier that it should still be noticeable, but now it was gone, or maybe covered by something else. I held my breath and listened harder. There was a sound, soft and slow, like steps. Not footsteps on hard ground, but something moving over wet leaves. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. It came from the direction of the stream. A slow rustle, then silence. Another rustle, then nothing. I told myself it was an animal. It had to be. A deer maybe, or a raccoon. I forced myself not to move, hoping it would pass. I stayed like that for several minutes, waiting. The sounds didn't come closer. After a while, I let myself relax again, telling myself I'd been half dreaming. But before I fell back asleep, I heard a faint snap, like a branch breaking. It came from farther away this time, deeper into the trees. Then silence again. I didn't sleep well after that. Every small sound outside the tent made me tense. By morning, I almost laughed at myself. The sunlight made everything look harmless again. The forest looked the same, and there were no tracks near my tent. Nothing to show anything had been close. I shook it off, cooked breakfast, and spent the day hiking farther upstream. I followed the stream for nearly an hour, through thicker forest. The ground grew softer and the trees denser. Eventually, I came across what looked like the remains of an old camp. A ring of stones half covered in moss, some scattered trash that had rusted or rotted over time. Maybe someone had camped here years ago. I found the corner of an old blue tarp buried under leaves, torn apart by weather and age. I stayed there for a while, sitting on a log and listening to the stream. There was something oddly heavy about that place. Not dangerous, just abandoned. The kind of spot where no one had been in years. I walked back before dark, but when I reached my camp again, something felt slightly off. It took me a few seconds to realize what it was. My cooler had been moved. Not far, just a few inches, but I knew I hadn't left it that way. I had a habit of placing it with the handle facing outward, but now it was turned sideways. The lid was still latched, though. Nothing missing. Maybe I'd nudged it earlier without noticing. Still, it bothered me. That night, I built the fire higher. The air had grown colder, and the dampness made the smoke hang low. I ate dinner and sat staring into the flames until my eyes watered. I didn't want to turn in too early because the wood seemed louder now, more alive in a way that didn't feel peaceful. By midnight, I finally crawled into my tent. I zipped the flap closed tight, even though I normally left it cracked open a little for air. I lay on my back, staring at the thin ceiling of nylon. The night was quiet again. No wind, no water sound from the stream. That bothered me more than anything. I should have been able to hear the stream, it was close enough. But the silence had weight, like the air itself had thickened. Then came the crunching sound again. This time slower, closer. I felt it more than heard it at first. The faint vibration of movement through the ground, the soft drag of a foot through damp leaves. My chest felt tight. I didn't move. I just listened. The steps stopped near the trees, maybe 20 feet away. I couldn't see anything outside. The tent walls were thin but darkened by the lack of moonlight. I waited, holding my breath again. Nothing. Then another step. Closer. I knew I wasn't imagining it. There was definitely someone or something moving near my camp. The next sound froze me completely. It was soft but clear. A small click like a pebble hitting another. Then a slow scraping noise, metal against stone. I reached for the flashlight near my sleeping bag but didn't turn it on. I didn't want to draw attention. I just gripped it tight, feeling my hand shake slightly. The sounds continued for maybe a minute, then stopped. I lay there waiting, every muscle tense. I must have stayed like that for half an hour before I heard nothing else and finally drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. When I woke up in the morning, my heart still felt heavy, like I hadn't truly rested. I crawled out of the tent into gray daylight. The fire pit was cold. The first thing I noticed was a faint line in the mud near the stones. Fresh, thin lines that curved around the fire pit. I bent closer. They weren't animal tracks. They looked like someone had dragged something narrow across the ground. A stick or maybe metal. I followed the marks a few feet until they disappeared into the brush toward the stream. I checked my cooler again. It was open this time. The latch wasn't broken, just undone. My food was still there, except one can of beans that had been taken. The strange part was the lid. It wasn't popped off with a tool or bent. It looked like it had been opened normally with a can opener. That didn't make sense. There was no reason for someone to be out there. I was miles from any town, and the road leading in was rough enough that no car would come through without me hearing it. I hadn't heard anything during the day, no engines or voices. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but I told myself it was probably just a hunter or someone passing through. Maybe they'd taken the can out of desperation. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That afternoon, I made a point to walk farther down the dirt road, just to see if there were any tire marks or signs of others. I found none. The mud was soft enough that even a bike would have left tracks, but it was smooth, undisturbed. When I came back to camp, everything looked the same. My nerves eased slightly. I gathered more firewood, made dinner early, and sat near the fire until well after dark. The forest was silent again. Too silent. Even the usual night insects seemed gone. It was around 10 p.m. when I noticed movement through the trees. Not loud, just enough to catch my eye. I turned my flashlight that way, shining between the trunks. For a moment I thought I saw something, just a shape, half hidden behind the brush. Human height, not moving. Then it was gone when I blinked. I told myself my eyes were playing tricks. The firelight and darkness together can do that. Still, I couldn't stop watching that spot. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my tent with the flashlight on, the beam aimed at the flap. Every half hour or so I heard soft noises outside. Brush moving, faint clicks, the sound of something brushing against the ground. Around 3 a.m., I heard a different sound, wet, heavy breathing. Not close but not far either, slow, steady breaths like someone trying. The trip started like most of my solo camping trips had. I had planned it for weeks, mapping out a stretch of forest I had never visited before, somewhere deep enough to escape the hum of civilization, but not so far that rescue would be impossible if something went wrong. I carried the usual: a small lightweight tent, a sleeping bag rated for the temperatures I expected, a backpack with food, water, a first aid kit, fire starting tools, and a couple of knives. My camera and a notebook were tucked away in case I wanted to document the experience. I drove for several hours, taking the back roads and dirt tracks until the asphalt thinned out, and the trees grew denser on both sides of the road. The moment I parked, there was a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional creak of branches swaying in the wind. I carried my pack a mile or so down a faint trail, stepping over roots and through fallen leaves that muffled my footsteps. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, the scent sharp and clean. I was looking for a small clearing I had spotted on satellite images. A perfect spot to pitch my tent near a stream, but still surrounded by enough trees to feel isolated. When I found it, the clearing was smaller than it appeared on maps, framed by tall pines and thick underbrush, and with a shallow stream cutting through one edge. I dropped my pack and took a moment just to breathe. The sun was starting to lower behind the canopy, filtering through branches and casting long shadows across the mossy ground. I set up my tent carefully, checking the pegs and making sure the rainfly was tight. Then I collected firewood, dry branches, fallen pine cones, and small logs. As I stacked them, I noticed how quiet the forest was. Not just quiet in the way the world is quiet when people are away, but in a way that felt dense, like the silence had weight. There were no birds singing anymore. No insects buzzing in the fading light, only the rustle of leaves whenever a breeze moved through. I shrugged it off. Forests have rhythms, I thought. Some nights are quieter than others. By the time I had my fire going, it was dusk and the shadows deepened to nearly black. The flames cracked and hissed and the light illuminated the edge of the stream. I sat on a flat rock near the fire, ate my dinner, just some canned beans and a protein bar, and then washed my plate in the stream. That's when I first noticed it. A faint sound, like the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves coming from the dense trees across the stream. My first thought was that it was an animal, deer or raccoon, moving through the underbrush. But as I listened, I realized the rhythm of the steps didn't make sense for an animal. They were deliberate, measured, and heavy, and they seemed to circle the clearing. I froze, straining my eyes, trying to catch a glimpse, but the darkness was thick, almost suffocating. The firelight didn't reach far enough to illuminate more than a few yards beyond the stream. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that the forest had noises and my imagination was running wild. I sat there for a while quietly, staring into the dark, listening. The steps stopped. I exhaled slowly, telling myself I was being paranoid. I finished my fire, leaving just enough embers to keep the warmth, and crawled into my tent. I zipped it closed, but the sound of the stream mixed with the occasional snap of a branch outside kept me alert. I lay on my sleeping bag, trying to relax, trying to sleep. But every rustle, every whisper of wind in the trees made me tense. I don't remember when I fell asleep, only that I did, in fits and starts. When I woke, it was completely dark outside the tent, pitch black because the moon had not risen yet, or maybe the dense canopy blocked it entirely. I had no idea how much time had passed, but something felt off. My instincts screamed at me. I unzipped the tent slightly, just enough to peek outside. That's when I saw it. A pair of eyes reflecting a dim light from somewhere, standing at the edge of the clearing near the tree line. They weren't animal eyes, not like a deer or a raccoon. The shape was tall, broad at the shoulders, and it stood motionless. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I tried to make it out more clearly, but my mind was frozen with fear. Then slowly, deliberately, it began to move, stepping between the trees, always keeping the shadows, never the light. I realized in that moment that I was not alone. There was someone else in the forest, someone who had been watching. I didn't have a gun. I didn't even have a flashlight on me. My only option was to stay quiet and make no movements that would draw attention. I slipped my hands to my pack and silently grabbed my small camping knife. My heart was hammering. The eyes disappeared behind a thick pine, and I could hear the crunch of leaves again, moving closer toward the stream. My mind raced through every possibility. What would happen if this person found me? I had no idea if they were armed, if they were dangerous. The logical part of me screamed to flee, to leave everything and run, but the fear of being caught while exposed paralyzed me. The steps stopped at the edge of the stream. I could hear water move as something or someone kicked a small rock into the shallow stream. The sound bounced, echoing eerily. My body trembled. I held my breath. Then, unexpectedly, the sound of movement receded slowly, deliberately, like they were backing away. I waited a long time, listening, until the night grew quieter again. My instincts told me to leave immediately, but I couldn't just leave in the dark and risk running straight into them. I waited until the first faint light of dawn began to seep through the trees. When I finally emerged from the tent, the forest looked ordinary again, almost peaceful, but the sense of unease didn't leave me. I packed my things quickly, not daring to make noise. As I crossed the stream, I noticed footprints in the soft mud near the edge. Large, heavy prints, unmistakably human, some of them still damp from the night. They hadn't been there the evening before. My stomach churned. Whoever had been out there was still close, watching, waiting. I decided to hike out through a less obvious path, sticking close to the stream to cover my tracks. The forest seemed to close in on me, branches scraping against my arms, roots threatening to trip me at every step. Every sound made me jump. A bird taking off, a squirrel dropping a pine cone. My mind was a storm of fear and adrenaline. I kept imagining someone stepping from behind a tree, emerging from the shadows. I forced myself to move steadily, focusing only on putting one foot in front of the other. Several hours passed. I kept my eyes on the path ahead, but I also tried to watch the surrounding trees for any sign of movement. The footsteps never returned. The eyes never appeared again, but I didn't dare relax until I was back on the dirt road where I had left my car. When I finally reached the car, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I didn't look back as I packed my gear into the trunk. I started the engine and drove off slowly, glancing in the rearview mirror to make sure no one followed. The road stretched on for miles, winding through the forest, but I never saw a figure in the trees again. By the time I reached the first town, the fear had dulled into a deep, lingering unease. I parked at a small diner, bought a coffee, and just sat, staring out the window. The memory of the eyes in the dark haunted me. I realized that the forest I had chosen, which I had thought was remote and safe, could conceal anything. People, dangers, hunters, trespassers, anything. And for a moment I understood how vulnerable I had been, completely exposed in the middle of nowhere. I never returned to that forest. I don't even think about camping alone anymore. The experience stayed with me, not like a story, but like a warning. The wilderness is beautiful, yes, but it is also full of people you don't see. People you can't predict. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that the real terror wasn't in a shadow or a rustle of leaves. It was the knowledge that I had been powerless, and that the forest had been silent, almost complicit, while someone had watched me. Years later, I told the story to a friend who was an experienced outdoorsman. He didn't laugh, didn't dismiss me. He only nodded and said that there are parts of the forest where people go unnoticed, where tracks fade and footsteps vanish. The wilderness is not always dangerous because of the animals or the weather. Sometimes it's dangerous because of other people, and that truth has stayed with me longer than the memory of the night itself. The experience taught me to respect not just the forest, but its hidden inhabitants. To this day, whenever I go anywhere remote, I carry more than just survival tools. I carry awareness. I carry caution. And I never ever underestimate the quiet weight of the unseen. The forest isn't alive in the way people imagine, it's indifferent. But the people in it, that is where real danger hides. I still remember the eyes, and I still remember the silence, and I know that, even though I walked away, I was lucky. Some people don't. And that memory is why I will never ever take solitude in the wild for granted again. I went camping alone for the first time in early October. It wasn't exactly a brave decision or some bucket list thing. I just wanted to clear my head for a few days. I'd been working nonstop for months, sleeping poorly, and I felt trapped in the routine of city noise, screens, and deadlines. A friend of mine once told me that solitude in nature fixes the mind, so I figured I'd give it a try. I found a small state forest about 3 hours from where I lived. It wasn't a popular camping area. No designated sites, no ranger station, just some gravel roads and old logging trails that led into thick woods. That's what appealed to me. I wanted isolation. I spent 2 days getting ready. I packed everything carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, food, a small propane stove, flashlight, knife, extra batteries, map, compass, and a few bottles of water. I left my phone off except to use GPS when I needed it. The plan was simple. Hike a couple miles into the woods, set up camp near a creek I saw on the map, and spend 2 nights there before heading home. Nothing extreme, nothing risky, just quiet. I left early in the morning. The drive was long but calm. The trees along the highway had already started changing color, and by the time I reached the gravel road leading into the forest, the air had that heavy stillness you get before fall rain. The place was deserted. No cars, no signs of people. Just the sound of my tires crunching gravel. I parked at a small clearing near a locked gate and followed a narrow trail that cut through the woods. It was barely visible in some spots, covered in fallen leaves and overgrown brush. It felt untouched, which I liked. After about an hour of walking, I found the creek. It wasn't wide, just a narrow stream with clear water running over smooth rocks. I decided to set up camp on a small rise nearby where the ground was flat and dry. The trees were thick enough to block most wind, but open enough that I could still see the sky above. It felt right, quiet, private, and natural. Setting up camp took maybe 30 minutes. I pitched the tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and gathered some dry wood to make a small fire. The smell of wet leaves mixed with smoke reminded me of being a kid again, camping with my dad. I hadn't done it in years. When the sun started going down, I cooked some canned stew on the stove and ate slowly, watching the forest turn dark. The temperature dropped fast, and by the time I crawled into my tent, I could already hear distant rustling, wind through trees, small animals moving through brush, maybe raccoons or deer. It was peaceful, but there was always that faint unease when you're alone in a place like that. Every sound seems sharper. That night I slept lightly. I woke up several times, sometimes to silence, sometimes to the soft cracking of branches somewhere in the distance. It wasn't threatening, just constant. Around 3 a.m. I woke again and noticed a faint sound of running water. It was the creek. But then I realized something else. There was a steady tapping sound, like someone knocking softly on wood. I lay there listening. It wasn't close, more like 20 or 30 feet away. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe it was a branch moving in the wind, but it kept happening, uneven, irregular. After a few minutes, it stopped. I stayed awake for a while after that, staring into the dark roof of the tent, waiting for it to come back. It didn't. I eventually fell asleep again. The next morning was gray and cool. Mist hung low over the creek. I made coffee and walked a short distance from the camp to look around. The forest was beautiful but quiet, too quiet. Even the birds were mostly silent. I followed the creek for maybe half a mile, just exploring, and I noticed footprints in the soft mud along the bank. At first I thought they were mine, but these were bigger. The tread pattern looked different too, like heavy boots. They were recent, edges still sharp. I stared at them for a while, confused. It was public land, so technically anyone could be out here. But I hadn't seen or heard a single person since arriving. No parked cars, no voices, nothing. It made me uneasy. I followed the prints a little farther until they turned up into the woods, then I stopped. I didn't want to start imagining things, so I told myself maybe a hunter or hiker had passed through earlier. I went back to camp and tried to shake it off. I spent the day relaxing, reading, and taking photos of the forest. By evening, I felt better again. The second night, though, things felt different. It started around sunset. I was sitting by the fire eating when I noticed the woods had gone completely still. No insects, no wind, no distant water sound. Just absolute stillness. I remember sitting there for maybe 10 minutes before realizing how unnatural it felt. I turned off my small lantern and just listened. Then somewhere behind me I heard a soft crack, like a footstep on dry leaves. I froze. It came again, slow, deliberate. I turned my head, trying to see into the dark, but the trees swallowed everything. The firelight barely reached 10 feet. Another crack, closer this time. My stomach tightened. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, but the sound had rhythm. Not random, like someone shifting their weight carefully. It stopped. Nothing moved for maybe 5 minutes. I finally stood up slowly and tossed a few pieces of wood onto the fire to make it brighter. I scanned the trees, but there was nothing. Eventually I sat back down, pretending to ignore it, though I couldn't stop glancing into the dark. I didn't sleep well that night either. Sometime after midnight I woke again to the same tapping sound as before. Only this time it was closer, much closer. It came from the direction of the creek. Tap. Pause. Tap, tap. Pause. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't move. Then faintly I heard the crunch of leaves again, like someone stepping near the water. Slow, heavy steps. I reached for my flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I just waited. The steps stopped for a long moment, then I heard what sounded like something metallic. Maybe a can being kicked or moved. Then silence again. I lay there until dawn, barely breathing, every sound making me jump. When morning came, I got out and walked to the creek. The mud along the bank looked disturbed, as if something or someone had walked through it during the night. I found another set of boot prints. Same size, same pattern as before, but now they led directly toward my campsite. They stopped about 20 feet from my tent and turned back toward the creek. That's when the realization really sank in. Someone had been watching me. I had been planning the camping trip for months, thinking about it constantly, imagining the quiet, the smell of the pine trees, and the way the sunlight would fall through the branches in the early morning. I needed the break more than anything. My life had been moving too fast, too loud, and the city had started to feel like a cage. I packed my old Subaru with everything I thought I could possibly need. A 2-person tent, a sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures, a small stove, a decent amount of canned food, water bottles, a first aid kit, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I even packed a compass and a paper map, because I wasn't about to trust my phone's signal in the middle of the woods. I wanted a place far from any trailhead, far from other campers, and far from people. Solitude was what I needed, and I thought I was ready for it. I drove for hours, leaving the city behind, the roads getting narrower and rougher until eventually I was on a gravel path surrounded by thick, dark trees. I kept the windows down, letting the smell of damp earth and pine fill the car. It was early afternoon when I found a small clearing off the path. The ground was flat, dotted with fallen leaves and pine needles, and I could hear a small stream somewhere in the distance. It wasn't marked on my map, which made it perfect. I parked the car and got to work setting up camp. I picked a spot just a little higher than the stream, so that I wouldn't wake up with wet feet if it rained overnight. I unpacked the tent and began to lay it out. The zipper made that familiar screeching sound as I pulled it open, and I shook the sleeping bag out, tested the poles, and pegged everything firmly into the ground. I double-checked that it was secure, imagining the wind whipping through the trees at night. Once the tent was up, I gathered some firewood. It wasn't hard to find. Branches and twigs littered the forest floor, but I made sure to look for dry pieces. Wet wood wouldn't light easily, and I didn't want to struggle with smoke all night. I piled the firewood in a small circle and began to arrange smaller kindling in the middle. By the time I finished, the sun was already lowering, spilling orange light across the treetops. I lit the fire with my matches, feeling the small victory of sparks catching and flames growing. The fire gave off heat and a comforting light. I sat back for a moment, letting my legs stretch out on the dry ground and listened to the forest. The sound of the stream mingled with the wind in the pines, and I could hear birds settling down for the night. Everything felt peaceful, untouched. I cooked a simple dinner over the fire, beans and rice with a small tin of tuna, and ate slowly, savoring the quiet. As darkness fell, I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and turned on my flashlight. The walls of the tent glowed softly, casting shadows that danced like ghosts, though I told myself it was only the fire outside. I tried to read a bit, but my eyes kept drifting to the tent walls, listening for any unusual sounds. The forest was alive even at night. Somewhere nearby, an animal rustled. Maybe a raccoon, maybe a deer, maybe something else. My heartbeat quickened slightly, but I reminded myself I was alone and careful. I had locked the car doors and kept my knife within reach. I slept fitfully. Every snap of a twig outside my tent made me jolt awake. I would lie there, holding my flashlight, straining to hear what it was. Mostly it was the wind and small creatures, but at one point I thought I heard something heavier. Footsteps on packed dirt, deliberate, slow. I stayed still, holding my breath, and after a while it stopped. I told myself it had to be a deer, moving cautiously in the dark. I forced myself to sleep again, though I kept my knife under my pillow. Morning came in a haze of fog. The fire had burned out overnight, leaving only a pile of gray ash. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the damp air, my shoes sinking slightly into the wet earth. The stream glistened faintly in the fog. Everything looked normal, quiet, untouched. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there the night before. I packed a small breakfast, instant oatmeal and coffee, and ate sitting on a fallen log near the stream. The forest seemed alive with movement, but nothing got close enough to alarm me. I spent the day exploring, following the stream deeper into the woods. The terrain was rougher than I had anticipated. Fallen trees created obstacles, and the undergrowth tore at my pants. I marked my path on the map, but soon I realized I had wandered further than I had planned. The forest grew denser, the trees thicker and closer together, and I noticed small animal tracks. Some deer, some smaller, unknown. The farther I walked, the quieter it got. Birds stopped singing. Even the wind seemed to die down between the trunks of the trees. As the sun lowered again, I returned to camp, carrying extra firewood I had collected along the way. But something was off. The fire pit I had made yesterday, the carefully arranged wood, was disturbed. I froze, scanning the clearing. The tent was untouched. The car was where I left it, but the circle of firewood had been scattered like someone or something had stepped through. My stomach tightened. I double-checked everything, peering into the trees. Nothing moved, nothing appeared, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I rebuilt the fire, piling the wood higher and arranging kindling more carefully. I cooked another simple dinner, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my chest. The forest at night was louder now, every rustle of leaves and snapping of branches amplified. I lay in my tent again, flashlight ready, knife under my pillow. The footsteps returned, slower this time, closer. They circled my tent, hesitant, deliberate. I held my breath, listening. Then a branch snapped directly behind me, just outside the tent flap. My heart jumped into my throat. I could hear the ground being stepped on carefully, slowly, but I stayed perfectly still, hoping whatever it was would move on. It didn't. Hours passed. I didn't sleep at all that night, lying in the dark, barely breathing, gripping the knife. At some point I heard a low growl, deep, not quite human. My pulse raced. My mind ran through every possibility. Wild animal, bear, mountain lion, someone else camping illegally nearby. My phone had no signal, and the thought of walking through the forest at night unarmed terrified me. I stayed put, listening to the noises shift and wander around me until the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. Morning came reluctantly. I unzipped the tent cautiously, peering out. Nothing, no footprints, no sign of an animal, just the scattered firewood I had rebuilt the night before. I packed up quickly, keeping my senses alert. Every crackle, every movement in the brush made me pause. I didn't make a fire that morning. I didn't even eat. I just wanted to get out. I retraced my steps along the stream, following the trail I had marked, but the forest seemed different in the daylight. Shadows were still deep, the air still heavy with dampness and the smell of decay. By noon I thought I saw smoke in the distance. My heart lifted. Maybe it was another camper, maybe a ranger. I headed toward it cautiously. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't smoke from a fire, but dust rising from the path. A truck appeared, a forest ranger's vehicle, moving slowly along a rough dirt road. Relief flooded me. I ran toward it, waving my arms. The ranger stopped, leaned out, and saw me. After explaining my situation quickly, they drove me back to the main road. I explained everything: the footsteps, the growl, the disturbed firewood. The ranger nodded. They said I had likely encountered a bear moving through the area, maybe a mother with cubs. Bears were active in that region, especially at night. My relief was huge. Everything I had feared, the footsteps, the growl, was real, but it wasn't something supernatural. It was nature, wild and dangerous. I went home that day, exhausted, dirty, and shaken. I told myself I had learned a valuable lesson. The forest was beautiful, but it was unpredictable. I had underestimated it, underestimated the animals and the dark silence that could conceal them. I never doubted again the sound of footsteps in the dark or the sense of being watched. Nature didn't need ghosts to be terrifying. It was terrifying enough on its own. I still go camping sometimes, but I never go alone, never without checking every safety measure, and I always leave a clear plan of where I am. I've learned to respect the forest, not just for its beauty, but for the raw, unpredictable power it holds. That trip, though terrifying, made me more cautious, more prepared, and more aware that even a peaceful forest can become a nightmare if you ignore its reality. It was months before I could look back without feeling a shiver run down my spine. But in the end, I survived. I came home alive, and I brought with me the memory of fear, the knowledge of danger, and the respect that only a brush with the wild can teach. The forest stayed behind me, dark, quiet, and indifferent, while I returned to the safety of civilization, never forgetting that night, the footsteps, and the growl that reminded me how small and vulnerable I truly was. I had always loved the woods. The smell of damp earth and pine, the quiet hum of nature at night, the way the light filtered through the trees in the early morning. It was everything I needed to escape the constant noise of the city. I had been camping many times before, mostly in state parks or campgrounds that were at least semi-controlled, with clear trails and other people nearby. But that weekend, I wanted something different. I wanted real wilderness, a place where I could be alone with nothing but the forest around me. So I drove for hours, navigating smaller and smaller roads, eventually reaching a dirt path so overgrown I had to slow to a crawl. The map I had printed off months ago showed a remote clearing somewhere beyond that path, and I told myself that this would be the perfect spot. The sun was low when I finally parked the car. The orange and pink sky streaked behind the tops of the trees. I grabbed my pack, which was heavy with all the supplies I thought I might need. Food for 3 days. Water, a small stove, my tent, a sleeping bag. First aid kit, flashlight, extra batteries, knife, and fire-starting equipment. I had also packed a small saw, just in case I needed to cut branches for a fire or to clear a path. I checked my GPS one last time. I was about a mile from the clearing, the path narrow and twisting through dense forest. The walk in was slow. Branches scratched my arms despite wearing long sleeves, and the uneven ground forced me to watch every step. I crossed a few small creeks, jumping from rock to rock, the water cold and rushing over my boots. At one point I stopped to catch my breath and noticed how quiet it was. Not just the absence of people or cars, but the forest itself seemed to hold its breath. There was no rustle of small animals, no birds singing, just the wind occasionally moving through the higher branches. I shook the thought off and continued. Eventually I reached the clearing just as the sun disappeared behind the horizon. It was smaller than I had imagined, roughly the size of a basketball court with grass that was slightly flattened, suggesting that people had camped here before. There were no fire rings, no evidence of recent use, just the faint impressions in the dirt and grass. I set my pack down and surveyed the area. The trees formed a natural barrier around the clearing, and the shadows between them were dense and dark. I felt a small shiver run through me, but told myself it was just excitement. Setting up the tent took longer than expected. I had chosen a spot on slightly higher ground, hoping it would stay drier if it rained. The ground was uneven, and I had to move rocks and dig small depressions for the tent stakes. Once it was up, I laid out my sleeping bag and organized my gear inside the vestibule. I left the food in a waterproof bag a few feet from the tent, hung from a low branch to keep it out of reach of any wandering animals. Then came the fire. I gathered small twigs and dry leaves, carefully arranging them before adding larger branches. The wind had picked up slightly, and lighting the fire took a few attempts. When it finally caught, the flames flickered and cast a warm glow across the clearing, and I felt a small sense of satisfaction. Night fell quickly. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, washing it down with water. Then I sat close to the fire, letting its warmth soak into my muscles and listening to the forest. Every few minutes there was a crack from a branch breaking under the weight of an animal, or the rustle of leaves as a creature moved unseen. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, nothing more. Eventually I crawled into the tent, zipped it closed, and settled in for the night. Sleep did not come immediately. I could hear every sound outside, the snap of twigs, the skittering of small feet, the occasional thump of something heavier moving through the underbrush. It was impossible to tell how far away anything was, and my imagination started filling in the gaps. I tried to remind myself that humans had been camping in the woods for millennia without being eaten alive, but it didn't help much. I finally drifted off, only to be woken a few hours later by the sound of something large moving near the clearing. It wasn't a light rustle or the steps of a small animal. It was deliberate, heavy, almost like something was pacing. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The sound moved slowly around the perimeter of the clearing. My heart pounded in my chest, and I kept my hand near my knife. The fire had burned low, and the shadows it cast seemed to stretch further into the darkness. Whatever it wasn't close enough to see clearly, but it was definitely there. After what felt like hours, the sound moved away, and I finally drifted back to a fitful sleep. The next morning I woke early. The fire had mostly burned out, leaving only embers and a faint smell of smoke. The clearing looked different in daylight, less threatening but still unnervingly quiet. I had planned to spend the day exploring the surrounding forest, following a faint animal trail that led deeper into the trees. I packed a small bag with water, a snack, my knife, and my flashlight, leaving the main pack at the tent. The trail was narrow and almost invisible in places, overgrown with ferns and brambles. I moved slowly, trying not to disturb anything more than necessary. As I walked, I noticed signs that something larger had passed through recently. Broken branches, deep tracks in the mud, and areas where the grass had been flattened. The tracks were large, wider than any deer I had seen, and the claws were clearly visible. My stomach twisted, but I told myself again that it was probably just a bear. Bears were common in this area, and while they could be dangerous, most would avoid humans if given the chance. By midday, I had ventured farther than I intended. The trail disappeared completely, leaving only thick forest in every direction. The sunlight barely penetrated the canopy and the air was heavy and humid. I stopped to rest on a fallen log, taking a long drink of water and scanning the forest around me. That's when I heard it, a low guttural sound coming from nearby, almost like a growl. I froze, trying to pinpoint its location. The sound was intermittent, not constant, but definitely coming closer. I considered my options. Going back the way I came seemed risky, especially if whatever it was had been following me. Pushing forward was equally dangerous, as I had no idea where I was heading. I decided to stay put for a moment, hoping that whatever it was would move on. I clutched my knife tightly and stayed very still. After a tense few minutes, the sound stopped, replaced by the normal forest noises. My hands were shaking, and my chest ached from adrenaline, but I forced myself to calm down. Eventually, I made my way back to the clearing, keeping my eyes and ears open for any sign of the creature. When I finally arrived, I was relieved to see my tent still standing, my supplies untouched. The fire had burned out completely, leaving only ash. I quickly started another fire, this time building it larger and higher, hoping the smoke would deter any curious animals. I ate quickly, my appetite diminished by the previous encounter, and decided to stay in the clearing for the rest of the day. As night fell again, I kept the fire going, adding larger logs to ensure it wouldn't die out. The sounds of the forest were more pronounced than before. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me tense. I lay in my sleeping bag close to the fire, keeping the knife within reach. Hours passed and nothing approached. I drifted in and out of sleep, waking frequently to check the fire and listen for sounds. Around 3 a.m., I was woken by a loud crash. Something had hit the edge of the clearing with force, like a tree branch or a large animal running into the side. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, just the outlines of trees and the occasional shadow. Then I noticed movement, a large shape disappearing into the shadows at the edge of the clearing. It was massive, easily the size of a small car, with dark fur and long claws. My stomach dropped and I realized I was looking at a bear. A big one, possibly a mother. I stayed perfectly still, shining the light in the direction it had disappeared. The bear didn't come back immediately, but I knew it was still close. I remembered everything I had read about surviving bear encounters. Stay calm, don't run, make yourself look big, and make noise if it approaches. I had no time to make myself look bigger. All I could do was stay by the fire and make small noises, tapping my knife against the pot I had used to cook earlier. The bear growled in response, a deep, menacing sound that shook the air. I kept tapping, slowly moving backward toward the tent, careful not to turn my back. Hours passed. I didn't sleep at all, just staying close to the fire, watching and listening. The bear eventually moved off, though I could hear it in the distance for a long time, breaking branches and rustling leaves. The first light of dawn brought relief, though I was exhausted. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, leaving nothing behind. Every sound made me jumpy as I retraced my steps to the car. The tracks I had seen earlier were still visible, but now they were joined by more, larger, and deeper impressions. I didn't stop to look closely. I just focused on getting out. The hike back took longer than the walk in, and every shadow seemed alive. When I finally reached the car, I collapsed into the seat, shaking and sweating. The engine roared to life, and I drove out of that forest as fast as the rough road would allow. Even after I left, the image of that bear stayed with me, the way it had moved silently, the low growl, the sheer size. It was a reminder that the wilderness I had been planning this solo camping trip for months, mapping out trails, checking maps, packing gear, and imagining the silence of the deep woods. I wanted isolation, a chance to push myself and to experience nature without distraction. My pack was heavy, full of supplies, food, water, a first aid kit, extra layers of clothing, a reliable tent, sleeping bag, fire-starting tools, and a small stove. I double-checked everything, down to the small flashlight in my pocket and the pocket knife strapped to my belt. By early morning, I had loaded everything into my car and left, the sky just beginning to lighten with streaks of pale pink and gray. The drive was long. I left the highway behind and wound along gravel roads that cut through dense forest, the smell of wet pine and moss thickening with each mile. Eventually, the road narrowed further until it became just a dirt track, and I parked my car near a clearing I had found on an old topographical map. I checked my watch, 10:17 a.m. It was early and I still had most of the day to hike into the deeper sections of the forest. I slung my pack over my shoulders and started down a barely visible trail that led into the trees. At first, the forest seemed peaceful, almost inviting. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in mottled patterns. Birds called intermittently from above, and the wind rustled through the leaves in a soft, comforting sigh. I kept a steady pace, my boots crunching over fallen twigs and leaves, occasionally slipping on moss-covered roots. I reminded myself to stay aware. I had read about hikers getting lost even in areas they thought they knew well. By noon, I had gone several miles in, and the trail disappeared almost completely. I paused to drink some water, leaning against a thick oak and taking in the silence. Beyond the occasional bird call, the woods were still. My stomach rumbled, and I took out a small sandwich I had packed, eating slowly while scanning the surroundings. Everything seemed normal, I continued, moving cautiously. The forest became denser, the trees taller, the underbrush thick. Small streams crisscrossed the trail, and I had to navigate around fallen trees or duck under thick branches. By late afternoon, I realized I had hiked further than I had intended. I glanced at my map, trying to find a suitable spot to camp. I wanted something flat, safe, and with access to water, but also hidden enough to give the feeling of solitude. Eventually, I found a small clearing with a gentle slope, surrounded by tall pines and maples. The ground was soft with a mix of soil and pine needles. A small creek ran nearby, the water clear and cool. I decided this would be my site. I dropped my pack, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease slightly. I surveyed the area for potential hazards. Dead trees that could fall, uneven ground, insect nests. Everything seemed okay. Setting up the tent was straightforward. I hammered the stakes into the ground, stretched the rainfly, and arranged my sleeping bag inside. My heart still beat a little faster from the hike, the exertion mingling with a sense of unease. I tried to shake it off as typical first-night jitters. I started gathering wood for a fire, picking dry branches from the forest floor and stacking them in a small cleared area a few feet from the tent. I was meticulous. The last thing I wanted was an uncontrolled fire. By late afternoon, the fire was crackling nicely, casting flickering shadows across the clearing. I boiled water on my stove and made a simple dinner of dehydrated rice and vegetables. The smell of cooking mixed with the scent of pine and damp earth was comforting. As the sun dipped lower, the forest darkened. Shadows stretched long and thick, and the forest grew quiet. Even the birds had gone silent, and the only sound was the creek nearby and the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. I finished eating and sat near the fire, staring into the flames. That's when I noticed it. A faint, distant sound, almost like the clatter of something metal. I froze, listening carefully. It stopped. I told myself it was just a branch falling or an animal, but my mind refused to settle. The forest had become colder, the shadows more pronounced, and the feeling of being watched crept over me. I gathered a bit more firewood, trying to ignore the unease. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped sharply. I zipped myself into the sleeping bag, but I stayed near the fire, adding logs as it burned down. That's when I heard it again. A rustling from deeper in the forest, deliberate, moving, not like a deer or small animal. I strained my eyes in the dim light, the shadows shifting unnaturally. The sound came closer, then paused. I gripped my flashlight and quietly reached for the pocket knife. Minutes passed with tense silence. Then a low growl, deep and guttural, rumbled through the trees. My heart raced. My mind ran through possibilities, a bear, a mountain lion, or something I couldn't identify. I knew bears were in this region. I remembered my research. Make yourself look big, make noise, don't run. But I didn't want to leave the fire. It was my only barrier. The growl repeated, closer now. I picked up a branch, ready to throw it if necessary, and tried to slow my breathing. Suddenly, something crashed through the underbrush, and I saw a large shape loping along the tree line. It wasn't running directly at me yet, but it was circling, keeping a distance while keeping me in sight. I estimated its size easily larger than a man, a bear. I had heard of bears wandering near campsites, but rarely this bold. I realized the mistake. I had not hung my food properly, and the scent of my dinner probably drifted through the air. I stayed still, careful not to make sudden movements. The bear paused again, sniffing the air. I remembered advice: talk calmly, make yourself seem bigger. I slowly stood, holding my branch and shouting loudly. The bear hesitated, growling. It circled once more, eyes glinting in the firelight. I could see the muscles rippling under its thick fur. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that would trigger a chase. After what felt like hours, though it was only minutes, the bear slowly retreated into the forest. I didn't move until I heard the underbrush settle completely, the creek burbling normally again. My hands were shaking and my heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I checked my tent and supplies. Nothing was disturbed, but the reality of how close I had been sank in. I could have been torn apart in moments if I had made a wrong move. I spent the rest of the night near the fire, barely sleeping. Every rustle, every distant sound made me tense. I realized the importance of being prepared, of respecting nature, and of never underestimating the wild. By morning, the sun finally broke through the trees and the forest seemed less menacing. Birds called tentatively and the temperature warmed. I knew I had survived the night, but I also knew I had been lucky. After breakfast, I decided to break camp. I packed everything carefully, checking that I hadn't left food or trash behind, and stored my supplies securely. I traced my steps back along the trail, moving quickly but cautiously. The previous night's fear had left me hyper-aware. I scanned the trees for signs of wildlife, listened for snapping twigs, and avoided the creek where water crossings could slow me down. Around midday, I stumbled upon another hiker, a man who had been camping nearby. We exchanged nods, and I felt a strange relief in seeing another human. I told him I had encountered a bear, and he shared his own story of a close encounter last year. He confirmed what I had feared. The forest was full of large predators, and human mistakes often ended badly. His presence was reassuring, but I knew I wasn't truly safe until I reached my car. By late afternoon, I arrived at my car. I slumped into the seat, exhausted, sweat and dirt covering me, the pack heavy on my shoulders even though I had emptied some of the weight. I checked all gear, relieved that nothing had been damaged. I drove slowly, glancing into the forest on either side, a lingering tension in my chest. The drive back was quiet, my mind replaying the previous night over and over. I thought about how unprepared I had been for a predator encounter, how easily it could have gone wrong, and how crucial it was to respect the wilderness. Yet I also felt a strange satisfaction. I had faced the forest alone, survived a real threat, and learned firsthand the power of awareness, caution, and preparation. By evening, I reached the highway, the lights of nearby towns signaling a return to civilization. I stopped briefly to stretch, breathing in the smell of exhaust and asphalt instead of pine and moss. The contrast was jarring, but despite the relief, I knew part of me would always be drawn back to that forest. The solitude, the challenge, the raw edge of nature. I had been terrified, but I had also been alive in a way that city life rarely allowed. I drove home slowly, replaying every moment. I reflected on the fear, the adrenaline, the exhaustion, and the lessons. I realized that real horror doesn't come from ghosts or myths. It comes from being small, alone, and vulnerable in a world that can crush you without thought. And yet surviving it, learning from it, and respecting it made me feel stronger, more aware, and alive in a way I couldn't fully describe. When I finally parked at home and stepped inside, I unpacked my gear, cleaned my boots, and removed the dirt and debris from my clothes. I made a meal, ate slowly, and sat in silence, the hum of the city a stark contrast to the forest's depth. That night I slept deeply, knowing that I had survived something real, that the fear and tension had been genuine, and that I had respected nature enough to live through it. I had been planning this camping trip for months, The kind of trip where I could truly disconnect. My job had been suffocating me lately, a constant blur of screens and noise, and I needed a place where nothing mattered but the wind in the trees and the rhythm of my own breathing. I chose a remote area of national forest, far off the beaten path where I knew few people ventured. My backpack was heavy, loaded with essentials: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food for 4 days, water filter, a basic first aid kit, and a small axe. I double-checked everything in the parking lot before I began the hike. The trailhead itself was nearly hidden by overgrowth, a thin line of dirt weaving through dense pines and oaks. There was no one else there. No cars, no chatter, just the forest stretching endlessly. The first day was uneventful but beautiful. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in long golden streaks, and the air smelled damp and earthy. I hiked about 8 miles that day, keeping a steady pace, stopping only to rest and drink water. I passed through a small creek, its water crystal clear, and I knelt down to drink, feeling the cold, clean liquid slide down my throat. That night I set up camp on a flat patch of dirt surrounded by thick trees, my tent tucked against a slight incline for shelter. I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal: instant rice with canned beans and a bit of dried sausage. Smoke curled up into the sky, carrying the smell of my food into the forest. As darkness fell, I lay on my sleeping pad listening to the sounds of the night: branches creaking, small animals scuttling, the distant call of an owl. It was calming, almost hypnotic. I woke up early the next morning to mist clinging to the ground and dew soaking my tent. My clothes were damp, my sleeping bag heavy with moisture, but I didn't mind. I broke down my camp and continued along the trail, which gradually narrowed, turning into barely more than a deer path. I passed fallen logs, mushrooms clinging to rotting wood, and the occasional animal track. The air felt cooler now, heavier, almost like the forest itself was watching. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing beside a small pond. The water was still and dark, reflecting the sky above like glass. It seemed like the perfect place to set up camp. I pitched my tent and gathered firewood, careful to collect dry branches to keep the fire going through the night. As I worked, I noticed faint tracks in the mud near the water's edge. Large, uneven footprints partially washed by a shallow trickle. At first I thought they were deer, but their shape seemed wrong, too wide and irregular. I shrugged it off, assuming some other hiker had been here. I started a fire and cooked dinner again, this time with canned chili and a few slices of bread. Darkness fell quickly, the forest becoming dense and oppressive. I lay in my tent afterward, listening to the pond water lap gently at the edges, to the whisper of wind through the trees. Around midnight, I heard something that froze me. Not a loud noise, not a shout, but a subtle, deliberate crack, like the sound of a branch being snapped underfoot. My heart started pounding and I froze. The sound came again, this time closer. Another crack. It was someone or something moving slowly through the forest toward me. I didn't move, didn't breathe too loudly. My mind raced. Could it be another camper? Unlikely, this place was almost never visited. Could it be an animal? Bears made noise too, but this was different. Deliberate, careful steps, almost human. I reached for my flashlight, keeping my hand on the tent zipper. I wanted to peek outside to see, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. I stayed still, listening, the sound coming closer and then stopping. The silence that followed was suffocating, filled only by the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe a deer, but the prints earlier nagged at me, the wide, irregular shape. Hours passed like this. I didn't sleep. Every snap of a twig, every shift of the wind felt like it was aimed at me. Dawn finally came, pale and gray, filtering through the tent walls. I unzipped the flap slowly, expecting to see someone lurking, but there was nothing. Only the forest, empty and indifferent. I grabbed my axe and carefully walked around the perimeter of my sight, eyes scanning for movement, ears straining for sound. The tracks I had seen the day before were still there, fresh now in the mud, leading toward the pond but vanishing somewhere into the thick undergrowth. I decided to break camp immediately and move. I had planned to stay for another night, but after that experience, I wasn't taking any chances. I packed quickly, checked my gear, and started down the trail. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I hiked for hours, constantly glancing over my shoulder, feeling like I was being followed. Every shadow looked like a person crouching behind a tree. Every rustle of leaves was a step. By late afternoon, I reached a small ridge that overlooked the forest below. I stopped to rest, drinking water and catching my breath. That's when I saw it. A man, or someone wearing a jacket and pants that blended into the brown and green of the forest, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. My pulse spiked. He didn't move, just stood there, motionless, staring. I ducked behind a tree, trying not to make a sound. My mind raced through possibilities. Lost hiker, criminal, someone dangerous. I didn't know, and I wasn't going to wait to find out. I stayed low and moved off the main trail, taking a series of zigzags through the forest to make it harder for anyone to follow me. Hours passed in a tense blur. My legs ached, my stomach churned, but I kept moving. As night approached, I knew I couldn't keep hiking in the dark without risking injury. So I found a small hidden spot off the trail, far from the clearing, and decided to rest briefly. I kept my axe close and fire minimal, just enough for warmth. That night was worse than the previous one. Every sound seemed amplified. The crack of a branch, the hiss of a small animal, the distant flapping of wings. I didn't sleep, only closed my eyes to rest my body. And my mind kept imagining shapes in the dark, watching, waiting. By dawn, I was exhausted, nearly delirious, but I knew I had to keep moving. On the third day, I finally reached a logging road I had seen on the map. Relief washed over me in a heavy wave. I followed it for hours until I came to a main forest road, where I could see tire tracks and signs of human activity. My legs were trembling from exhaustion, my shoulders raw from carrying my pack, but I didn't stop. Eventually, I found a ranger station at the edge of the forest, and someone there called the authorities for me. I explained everything as best I could. The officers returned with me to the trail, and we found evidence of someone else in the forest. Campsites that had been hastily abandoned. Footprints and small traps set near streams. They didn't find anyone, but they told me it was likely someone using the area illegally, possibly living off the forest, watching travelers, maybe even preying on them. I realized how lucky I had been, how easy it could have been for me to disappear out there. I never returned to that forest. The experience stayed with me, a constant shadow in my mind whenever I went camping again. I never forgot the feeling of being watched, the quiet dread that settled over me at night, and the desperate, raw exhaustion that only comes from surviving a situation where you know you're not safe. Every trip I've taken since, no matter how remote, I check my surroundings constantly. I travel with more than one person, and I trust my instincts without question. Looking back, I understand that the forest is beautiful, but it is also indifferent. It doesn't care if you are there or not, and sometimes there are people in it who shouldn't be. People whose intentions are unknowable, dangerous, and patient. I had survived, but I know I was only lucky. The forest doesn't forgive mistakes. I had always been drawn to the wilderness. There was something about the smell of pine needles underfoot, the sound of water running over rocks in a distant creek, and the cold bite of night air that made me feel alive in a way city life never could. I had spent years camping in national parks, along rivers, and in isolated forests. I knew the routines, the dangers, the little signs that nature gave if you were paying attention. Yet despite all my experience, nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that weekend. It was late September, the kind of crisp autumn air that makes you pull your jacket tighter around your body. While watching the leaves change from green to gold and red, I drove hours from the city to reach a remote section of forest I had never visited before, somewhere in the northern part of the state. The directions were simple enough: a dirt road that wound through the woods for miles, turning into a narrow trail that ended in a small clearing by a creek. The idea was to spend 2 nights alone, just me, the trees, and the sound of the river. I had packed carefully, as I always did. Tent, sleeping bag, extra layers, food, water, first aid kit, and a couple of knives. The backpack felt heavy, but I didn't mind. The anticipation of being alone in the forest made every step easier. I arrived just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the dirt trail. The clearing was smaller than I had imagined, surrounded by dense pines and thick underbrush, but it had a clear view of the creek where I could hear the water splashing over rocks. I parked the car, grabbed my backpack, and started unpacking. Setting up the tent was routine. Stakes hammered into the ground, poles snapped into place, the rainfly stretched over the top. Once it was secure, I set my sleeping bag inside and organized my gear neatly. Everything had a place. I liked it that way. Night fell faster than I expected. Within an hour, the sun had disappeared completely, leaving the clearing bathed in deep blues and blacks, and the creek whispered continuously at the edge of my sight. I lit a small campfire, the kind you can make safely without fear of a forest fire, and watched the flames dance. Sparks flew upward, glowing briefly before disappearing into the darkness. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, dried pasta with a packet of sauce I had brought along and a few energy bars to follow. The smell of burning wood mixed with food soot filled the air, and for a while I felt the calmness I had hoped for. As the night deepened, I began to hear the forest in a way I never did during the day. The wind through the trees made a low moaning sound. The creek gurgled louder than I had noticed at first, its rhythm hypnotic. Somewhere deeper in the forest, an animal cried out, a sharp, high-pitched yelp that echoed and then disappeared. I thought it was a fox or maybe a coyote. That was when I noticed the first thing that made my skin crawl. The quiet. It wasn't the normal quiet of the woods. Normally at night there is some background noise. The hum of insects, the distant flapping of wings, the rustle of leaves. This night it was as if all of that had gone missing, leaving only my fire crackling and the creek. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the deep fall night and the animals had gone silent. I crawled into my sleeping bag, leaving the fire small but alive, and tried to sleep. The first hours passed uneventfully. I heard small twigs snapping now and then, maybe a deer moving through the underbrush, but nothing that concerned me. Then around 2 a.m, the sound began. At first it was subtle, a distant dragging sound, soft but deliberate. Something scraping along the forest floor. I froze, listening carefully. The wind was calm, so the sound wasn't the usual brush movement. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer dragging a branch, maybe a raccoon, but instinct made my heart race. It was coming closer. I got out of the sleeping bag quietly, careful not to make noise. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the darkness. The beam cut through the trees, illuminating nothing. Yet the sound continued. Slowly, methodically, something was moving toward me. My pulse was high, my hands trembling slightly, but I told myself to stay calm. The forest was my element. I knew how to handle wildlife encounters. I picked up a heavy stick that I had used to make the fire earlier and held it ready. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. The scraping grew louder, now distinct, like something solid being dragged over dirt and rocks. I flicked the flashlight around, catching shadows in the trees that moved unnaturally. I couldn't see what it was, but I could sense it was following the edge of the clearing, circling around me. My mind raced through possibilities, a bear, a large dog, some unknown wild animal. But the sound didn't match anything I had heard in all my years of camping. It wasn't random. It was careful, precise, deliberate. Someone or something was stalking me. I retreated slowly toward my car, keeping the flashlight trained on the darkness. The sound stopped for a moment, then shifted, moving closer to the fire. My stomach dropped. Whoever or whatever was out there knew I was alone. I considered getting into the car and leaving, but the trail was narrow and any sudden movement might provoke the creature. I had to think. I remembered the large knife in my backpack. Carefully, I retrieved it and kept my other hand on the flashlight. Then I saw it. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to understand. A shape hunched low to the ground, moving between the trees. Too large to be a deer, too calculated to be a bear. Its movements were precise, almost human, but the shape was distorted, tall and thin, dragging something along the ground. I froze. I couldn't scream, couldn't move. The creature or person stopped suddenly just beyond the edge of my firelight. I could hear heavy breathing now, uneven and harsh. Panic set in. My survival instincts kicked in fully. I knew I had to get out. Slowly, I moved backward toward my car, keeping the flashlight steady, not daring to look away. The shape followed, always just at the edge of the light. My car was small, a rental sedan, but it would provide at least some protection. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly I dropped them once before finally getting the door open. I climbed inside, locked it immediately, and kept the engine off, listening. Minutes passed. The dragging sound faded, then reappeared, this time circling the clearing. I held my breath, hoping it would leave. It didn't. The moon rose higher, casting silvery light into the clearing, and I could make out the shape clearly now. It was a man, or at least human in form, but his clothes were ragged, torn in places, and his movements were erratic, animalistic. He crouched low, his head moving side to side, observing the fire, observing me. I realized with a shiver that he had been watching me from the moment I set up camp. My blood ran cold. I knew I couldn't stay. I started the car quietly and slowly backed up, keeping the headlights off to avoid drawing attention. The man, if that's what he was, stayed in the clearing, watching. I waited until the engine was running fully and then drove off slowly, taking the dirt trail carefully. My heart pounded the entire way. I didn't stop until I reached a paved road, where I could see other lights in the distance. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. The next day I returned with local authorities. They searched the area but found nothing except remnants of a makeshift camp deep in the forest. Empty cans, old blankets, and footprints too large to be mine. There were no signs of the man, and the forest seemed peaceful in daylight, almost normal. They told me it was likely a transient living in the woods, possibly dangerous. I didn't care. I had been close enough to know how carefully and deliberately he had followed me, circling my campsite, waiting for a moment to approach. It changed the way I viewed the wilderness. I still love the forest, the mountains, and the rivers, but I learned that night that nature isn't the only danger. There are people living on the edges of it, watching, moving in ways you don't expect. And when you're alone, miles from civilization, you are vulnerable. I never camped alone in such a remote area again. I now take precautions. I check trails carefully, avoid isolated clearings, and make sure I'm always visible to others. That night I understood the raw unpredictability of being alone, and it left a mark on me I will never forget. Even now, years later, when I drive past a forest or see a clearing by a creek, I remember the dragging sound, the tall, hunched shape, and the knowledge that there are things in the world you cannot anticipate. Things that watch silently, waiting, and I remember the relief when I finally left that clearing alive and never looked back. I had been planning this solo camping trip for weeks, craving a break from the city, from the constant noise and the suffocating routines that had begun to feel like a cage around my life. I chose a spot that seemed remote enough, a state forest a few hours' drive from the nearest town. The maps were vague, showing only a dirt road that led to a clearing labeled as a campground, but I was certain the area would be quiet, untouched enough for me to really disappear for a few days. I loaded my old Toyota with my gear: a tent, a sleeping bag, a compact stove, enough food for 3 days, a first aid kit, and a set of maps with a compass. My phone would be mostly useless once I left the paved roads, but I liked that. It felt like stepping back in time. The drive was longer than I expected, the road turning into a patchwork of gravel and ruts, each mile making me feel more isolated, and more like I belonged somewhere far from human interference. By late afternoon, I reached the small clearing marked on the map. The site was perfect, a flat stretch of land surrounded by dense pine and oak, a small creek running nearby. The smell of wet earth and pine sap filled the air, and I felt the tension of weeks dissolve with each deep breath. I parked, unloaded my gear, and began setting up camp. I pitched my tent first, making sure it was anchored well into the ground. The poles were old but sturdy, and the fabric smelled faintly of storage. I staked it firmly, double-checked the rainfly, and arranged my sleeping bag inside. I then unpacked my stove, set up a small fire pit, and stacked wood I found nearby, carefully selecting dry pieces while leaving the damp ones aside. The ritual was comforting, the repetition of actions calming a mind always on edge. Once the Fire was crackling. I boiled water for a simple meal of noodles and dehydrated vegetables. I ate slowly, letting the warmth from the fire seep into my bones, appreciating the silence that seemed to stretch for miles. As the sun dipped below the tree line, the shadows grew longer, and the forest seemed to shift. The wind carried sounds I wasn't accustomed to, branches creaking, distant rustlings, the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. I reassured myself it was wildlife, deer, or maybe raccoons, nothing more. I lay back on my sleeping mat outside the tent for a while, staring at the sky as it deepened into a canvas of stars. The solitude was liberating. Night fell fully, and I crawled into my tent. The thin walls did little to insulate against the sounds of the forest, and I found myself listening intently to every creak and rustle. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that made my stomach knot. A crunching of leaves, deliberate and heavy, coming from the direction of the creek. My first thought was a deer, but the steps were too careful, too slow. Something else was moving there. I reached for the flashlight beside my sleeping bag, clicking it on. The beam illuminated the trees, the underbrush, but nothing moved. I strained to listen, every nerve on edge. The noise stopped after a few minutes, replaced by silence so deep it felt unnatural. I lay awake, heart pounding, replaying the sound in my mind. Eventually, fatigue overtook me, and I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. Morning came with mist hovering low over the forest floor. I packed up some fire remnants and prepared breakfast, all the while noticing signs that made my stomach tighten. Footprints near the creek, larger than any deer, human-like but irregular, as if the person walking had an uneven gait. I told myself I was imagining things, a leftover tension from the night, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that I wasn't alone. The day passed slowly. I hiked a few miles along the creek, documenting the trail and noting wildlife tracks, trying to convince myself that these were normal signs of people hiking nearby. The forest felt alive in a way it hadn't the day before, every bird call and rustle feeling amplified. As evening approached, I returned to camp, my mind restless, replaying every sound from the night before. I decided to reinforce my campsite, stacking logs around the perimeter of the clearing and arranging rocks near the tent to create a small boundary. My thoughts raced constantly. What if someone had been following me? But I rationalized, telling myself it was unlikely. The nearest road was miles away, and there weren't any other signs of campers in the area. That night the sound returned, louder this time. Footsteps circling my tent, the snap of branches too deliberate to be deer. I stayed perfectly still, my breath shallow, listening as the movement paused on the edge of my light. My flashlight flicked on instinctively, and the beam swept across the clearing. There, for a fleeting second, I saw a shadow moving behind the trees, vanishing as soon as I blinked. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I stayed alert, taking shifts between peering out of the tent and holding a heavy stick close at hand. Dawn eventually arrived, and with it a creeping sense of relief. I packed quickly, not wanting to linger, my hands trembling as I rolled up the sleeping bag and folded the tent. I wanted to get back to civilization, to roads, to safety. As I moved along the creek to take a different path back, I noticed more signs. Fresh footprints, broken branches, and discarded items. A small, empty water bottle, a crumpled piece of paper. It became clear someone had been in this area recently, possibly watching me. Panic mixed with adrenaline as I calculated the fastest route back. I stayed low, moving cautiously but quickly, listening for any sign of pursuit. Hours later, I emerged onto a main forest road. Relief hit me like a wave. The sounds of the forest, the unknown presence, felt distant now. I kept my eyes peeled, half expecting someone to step out from behind a tree, but the road was empty. I drove without pause, my hands gripping the steering wheel until I reached the first town, the lights of civilization washing over my frayed nerves. I reported the incident to the local ranger station, describing the footprints and the feeling of being watched. They took my report seriously and told me they had received other reports of trespassers in the area, people who would follow hikers, and campers sometimes camping near them, but never leaving traces behind for long. I was lucky, they said. Nothing had escalated, but it was a reminder that even in the wilderness, danger could take human form. In the following days, I replayed the experience over and over, trying to make sense of it, to reconcile the serenity I had sought with the fear I had encountered. I realized that the wilderness was not just a place of peace, but a place where humans could lose themselves in ways that weren't always comforting. The solitude I had craved had been invaded, and the forest that felt alive had also felt threatening. Eventually, I returned home, tired, tense but grateful. The experience left me cautious, more aware of my surroundings, but it also gave me a story of resilience. I learned to respect the wilderness not just for its beauty, but for its unpredictability, for the fact that being alone out there meant being fully responsible for my own safety. I kept my maps and compass close, my emergency gear checked, and when I camped again, I did so with a sharper mind, attuned to every sound and movement, knowing that sometimes the scariest thing in the woods isn't nature itself. It's the unseen, lurking presence of another human, and the knowledge that for a brief moment you were not in control. In the end, I never saw the person again, but I knew the forest had been watching me, teaching me a lesson I would never forget. I learned to appreciate the solitude, but with caution. I never camped alone in that area again, and I always made sure someone knew my route. The experience changed the way I approached wilderness adventures forever, embedding a deep respect for the balance between solitude and vulnerability. And though I left the forest, I carried its lessons with me, vivid and unrelenting, a reminder of the thin line between peace and peril in the wild. I had always loved the idea of being alone in the woods. Not the kind of alone where you're surrounded by civilization or the distant sound of cars, but true isolation, the kind where the forest stretches in every direction and no human sound reaches you. I had grown up camping occasionally with my family, but as I got older, the desire to test myself on my own had grown stronger. That year I decided to take a week-long solo trip into a section of national forest I had scouted for months. Maps, satellite images, old ranger notes, and online reports told me it was remote, difficult to reach, and rarely visited. It was perfect. I packed my backpack carefully: a tent, sleeping bag, portable stove, water filter, enough food for a week, extra batteries, a first aid kit, a compact axe, and a strong flashlight. I also had my knife strapped to my belt, something I always carried when I was in the backcountry. I drove to the trailhead early in the morning, the sky still gray from the dawn fog. There were a few other cars, but the moment I hit the trail, I left the occasional hikers behind and entered a corridor of trees so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. The first day was long but uneventful. I moved steadily, following an old logging road marked on my maps, and eventually found a small clearing I thought would be a good first night spot. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and lit a small fire. The smell of burning pine and damp leaves filled the air, and I felt that rare sense of calm that comes from being alone in the wild. The sky darkened and stars began to appear through the branches. That night I slept lightly, alert to every sound: the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, but nothing came close. The next day I pushed further into the forest. I was no longer following the logging road. I had veered off into unmarked trails, relying on my compass and GPS. By afternoon, I reached a ridge that overlooked a valley filled with thick, dark trees. I stopped for a rest, eating some of my trail mix and drinking water. The air was crisp and the forest seemed to hum with life. Birds, insects, the distant roar of a river. I noted the exact location in my GPS and decided to camp near the ridge that night, thinking it would give me a vantage point over the area. I set up my tent near a small flat area. I noticed animal tracks nearby. Deer, maybe a fox, nothing unusual. I built a fire and watched the flames lick the dry wood, letting my mind wander. As night fell, the forest became a chorus of sounds. Owls called, branches creaked, and somewhere a river whispered. The quiet, though beautiful, also carried a certain tension. Alone in the wilderness, every sound becomes larger, more threatening, more immediate. Around midnight, I woke to a snapping sound outside my tent. My heart thumped and I stayed still, straining my ears. It was far enough away that I told myself it was just a branch breaking or a deer moving through the forest. But then it came again, closer this time. Not the delicate footsteps of a small animal, but heavier, deliberate, uneven. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and swept it around outside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, rocks, and underbrush. Nothing moved. I told myself it was just my imagination. That fear twists your mind when you are alone. I eventually went back to sleep, though I stayed awake longer than usual. The next morning I found evidence that made my stomach tighten. Around my tent, the underbrush had been disturbed in ways that didn't match animal tracks. Footprints, human footprints, were pressed into the soft soil. They were large, heavy, uneven, like someone had been walking cautiously, stopping and starting. Panic settled in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. This forest was remote. There was no reason anyone should have been here, and I had no signal to call anyone. My only option was to keep moving, to put distance between myself and whoever had been there. I packed quickly, making sure my food was secure and that I left no trace of my presence. I retraced my steps down the ridge, trying to follow the river. I figured that anyone following me would have to stick to the larger trails, so moving along the water could give me some cover. Hours passed. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch had me freezing in place, heart pounding, scanning for movement. By late afternoon, I realized I had miscalculated. I had wandered farther than I intended, and I didn't recognize the terrain. That night, I found another clearing and set up my tent quickly, anxious to hide my presence. The forest felt different here, more oppressive. The shadows were deeper, the sounds sharper. I tried to keep the fire small, barely enough to cook and keep warm. The darkness beyond my small circle of light seemed endless, full of shapes and movement I couldn't identify. I slept fitfully, waking several times to the sound of snapping branches nearby. Each time I shone my flashlight into the darkness and saw nothing. The next morning I discovered something that made my stomach churn. My food supply had been disturbed. A small bundle of my dried meat and some trail bars were scattered, partially eaten. There were no signs of animals big enough to carry it, only footprints, human footprints, circling my tent. My mind raced. Whoever was here was not far. I realized I had to move fast and carefully to avoid being tracked. I packed everything in haste and left no trace behind. I decided to abandon my original route entirely and head toward a ranger station I had marked on my maps. As I moved, I became hyper-aware of every sound and shadow. The forest was dense and visibility was low. The sun was getting lower in the sky. I kept thinking I heard movement behind me, glimpses of figures disappearing into the trees. It could have been imagination, but I knew better. The footprints were real and they had been watching me. I stayed off the trail, moving through thick underbrush, relying on my compass to guide me. I kept my knife ready and the flashlight within reach, though I avoided using it to prevent drawing attention. By late afternoon, exhaustion was setting in. My legs were sore, my back ached from the pack, and I had barely eaten. The thought of spending another night being stalked was terrifying. I came across a small stream and stopped to refill my water, careful to make noise in a way that masked my presence. While crouched there, I thought I saw movement on the opposite bank, a shadow slipping between the trees. I froze, heart hammering, waited. It disappeared. I didn't wait to see more. I moved quickly, following the stream downhill, hoping it would lead me to a trail or road. As night fell, the forest became a maze. I couldn't see well, and every step was dangerous. I slipped on wet rocks, scraped my arms on branches, and had to stop several times to catch my breath. The thought of being alone in this vast wilderness with someone potentially following me was suffocating. I kept moving until I stumbled across a faint dirt road, barely visible in the moonlight. Relief washed over me. Human infrastructure, even a remote road, meant I could find my way to safety. I followed the road cautiously. Around midnight, I heard voices, distant but distinct. My first instinct was to hide, but then I realized they weren't angry or threatening. They were rangers conducting a late-night patrol. I stepped out onto the road and called out. They turned, flashlights illuminating the trees, and I ran toward them. Relief flooded me as they recognized my distress, took my details, and assured me I would be safe. They radioed for backup, and soon another vehicle arrived to take me back to the station. After a few hours, I was finally safe, seated in a warm ranger station, eating something hot and drinking water. They asked me questions, took my statements, and assured me they would investigate the area. I learned later that the forest had occasional illegal campers and hunters who could be aggressive or territorial, and it was likely that I had stumbled into one of these situations. The reality of what had happened sank in. The fear, the adrenaline, the isolation, it had been real, and the danger had been real. The next day I left the forest and returned home. I didn't want to camp alone again for a long time. But I also learned something important. Preparation, awareness, and respect for the wilderness are critical. I had survived because I stayed calm, used my knowledge and skills, and kept moving carefully. That experience stayed with me for years, a reminder that the wilderness is beautiful, but it can also be unforgiving, and that humans can be the most unpredictable danger of all. Even now, when I think back, I remember the quiet of the forest, the rustling shadows, and the weight of unseen eyes watching me. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also real, and surviving it gave me a clarity and appreciation for life that nothing else ever could. I remember the first time I decided to go camping alone in a dense forest far from any town. It wasn't a planned trip with a map or a schedule. It was impulsive. I wanted to escape the noise of the city, the constant hum of people and traffic, and immerse myself in a place where the only sounds were my own footsteps and the wind moving through the trees. I packed lightly. A small tent, a sleeping bag, a backpack with some canned food, water, a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a few other essentials. Nothing fancy, nothing that would slow me down. I wanted to be as self-sufficient as possible, to experience the forest in its rawest form. The hike in was tougher than I expected. The trail started well enough, wide and marked, but after a few hours it narrowed, became uneven, and was cluttered with roots and fallen branches. The sun was dropping lower with every step, casting long shadows that made the forest feel even thicker. There was a smell in the air, damp earth mixed with decaying leaves, the kind of smell that seeps into your clothes and hair. I found myself brushing aside low branches and stepping over logs, constantly scanning for signs of animals or other hikers. But the forest was empty. Quiet, too quiet. I finally found a small clearing that felt right for my campsite. It was surrounded by tall pines, and the ground was mostly flat, covered in a thick layer of pine needles that made it soft underfoot. I set up my tent carefully, making sure it was stable and level, and then started a small fire in a stone circle I cleared nearby. The fire was comforting, a small bubble of warmth and light in the growing darkness. I boiled water over it, ate some beans from a can, and watched the flames flicker. The sounds of the forest began to shift as night fell. Birds had gone silent, replaced by the rustle of leaves and distant animal calls I couldn't identify. I lay back on the ground outside my tent for a while, staring up at the night sky between the tree branches, feeling a strange mix of awe and unease. Around midnight, I began to notice it, a faint crunching sound, like twigs breaking under weight, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some small animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too steady. It wasn't hopping or scurrying, it was walking, and the steps were measured, almost cautious. I froze, listening, trying to pinpoint the direction. The sound came closer, then paused. I held my breath. The firelight barely reached beyond the clearing, leaving the trees beyond in darkness. I thought about grabbing my flashlight, but my hands felt heavy with adrenaline. I waited, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Silence swallowed the forest again. I convinced myself it was nothing, just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. I tried to sleep, but every rustle made me tense up. Then, hours later, I woke to the sound of something moving just outside the tent. Not a tap or a crackle, this was deliberate soft thuds circling the tent slowly. My heart raced. I remembered all the warnings I'd ignored about camping alone in remote areas. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and shone it out into the darkness. The beam cut through the blackness, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. Yet I had the distinct feeling of being watched. I stayed very still, barely breathing, watching for movement. After what felt like hours, the sound stopped. I told myself again it was just an animal. I crawled into my sleeping bag, flashlight by my side, trying to calm down. Morning came slowly, gray light filtering through the trees. The forest looked peaceful in daylight, but the events of the night left a knot in my stomach. I broke camp slowly, careful to leave no trace, and started hiking toward a small stream I had marked on my phone. The forest was alive in the morning. Birds called from the trees. Small animals scurried through the underbrush, and the wind moved the leaves in a constant whisper. I followed the stream, drinking from it cautiously after filtering some water with my portable purifier. The peaceful morning was comforting, but the memory of the previous night's sounds lingered. I began to notice details I hadn't before: claw marks on tree trunks, tufts of fur caught on branches, footprints in the soft mud by the stream that weren't quite animal-like. I paused, kneeling to examine them. They were elongated, larger than a dog's, with distinct indentations suggesting nails, not hooves or pads. I traced them cautiously, realizing they led deeper into the forest, away from the trail I had intended to follow. Fear and curiosity warred inside me. Part of me wanted to follow the tracks, to understand what had been moving around my campsite. But another part told me to get out, to leave before nightfall. I decided to mark the tracks mentally and return to them later if I survived. I spent the next hours hiking carefully along the trail, keeping my eyes open for more signs. I found remains of old campsites, fire pits, rusted cans, proof that humans had been here but not recently. That knowledge was oddly comforting. By late afternoon, I reached a ridge overlooking a dense valley. The view was stunning. A river snaking through thick green trees, mist rising from the water. I paused to rest, drinking from my water bottle, feeling the weight of my pack. That's when I heard it again. The soft crunch of steps, distinct and deliberate, echoing through the ridge. I froze, scanning the area, but saw nothing. Then a branch snapped closer, and I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Something large moving between the trees. Not running, not bounding, but moving carefully, keeping me in view. Panic surged. I turned and began descending the ridge quickly, taking care not to trip. The sound followed me, staying just far enough away that I couldn't see it clearly, but close enough to be unnerving. I stumbled into the valley as the sun sank low, shadows stretching long across the ground. I didn't stop until I reached a narrow dirt road that led to the nearest ranger station, miles from where I had started. I ran along it, adrenaline keeping me moving despite my exhaustion. By the time I saw the station's lights, relief flooded me. I reached it, drenched in sweat, heart hammering, and explained as calmly as I could to the ranger that I had encountered something moving around my campsite in the forest. They listened carefully, taking notes, but reassured me that there were known predators in the area: bears, cougars, but nothing had been reported as aggressive recently. They offered to drive me back to my car and warned me to avoid camping alone in such remote areas again. As I sat in the ranger's truck, watching the forest recede behind us, I realized how close I had been to something potentially dangerous. The thought of what might have followed me that night made my stomach churn. I never went back to that forest. Even months later, I couldn't shake the memory. The silent steps circling my tent, the dark shapes moving between the trees, the feeling of being watched without any clear threat. I began camping in more populated areas, places where there were other hikers, other campers. I kept the fire burning well into the night, always listening, always alert. The experience changed the way I approached the outdoors. It taught me that the forest, no matter how peaceful it looks in daylight, can hold dangers that are patient, observant, and unseen until they choose to make themselves known. Looking back, I understand now that I had underestimated the wilderness. I had assumed that my knowledge, my gear, and my caution were enough to keep me safe. They weren't. The forest is unpredictable, full of creatures and movements that humans can barely comprehend. And the memory of that first night alone, The suffocating darkness, the deliberate sounds of something stalking me, the unshakable feeling of being watched, remains vivid in my mind. It reminds me that some experiences once lived leave permanent marks, shaping how we interact with the world forever. I never returned to that particular site, but the lesson stayed. I began studying the forest I visited, learning the patterns of wildlife, understanding the signs of predators, and preparing for every possibility. I started keeping detailed journals of my hikes, marking areas that felt unsafe, noting the smallest tracks or broken branches. I also began to respect the forest in a way I hadn't before, not as a backdrop for adventure, but as a living, breathing ecosystem with rules I didn't fully control. Years later, when friends asked why I never camped alone in that region again, I would tell them only part of the story, enough to convey caution without fear. But every so often I think about that night, the untraceable presence circling my tent and the way the forest seemed to breathe around me. It taught me vigilance, patience, and humility, and in its own twisted way, it gave me a profound appreciation for the wild, raw beauty of the world when it is truly untamed. Even now, when I pack my gear for a hike, I double-check everything, ensure my emergency equipment is in order, and carry more than I think I'll need. The memory of that night lingers, a quiet warning that the forest is never as empty as it seems. Every rustle, every crack of a branch, every flicker of movement reminds me of that first night alone, and I am always ready, always alert, because the wilderness does not forgive carelessness. This experience reshaped how I approached life outside the city, teaching me that survival isn't just about skill or preparation, it's about respect, awareness, and never underestimating the unknown. The forest remains one of the few places where I feel completely alive, but also completely humbled, constantly reminded that nature can be beautiful, terrifying, and unforgiving all at once. I had always loved camping. The smell of pine in the morning, the sound of a river running over rocks, the wind through the trees, everything about being in the woods felt grounding to me. I had done countless trips on my own, always careful, always prepared, and always making sure to leave a clear itinerary with someone back home. That Saturday, I decided to do a solo trip in a remote area of the forest I hadn't been to before. It wasn't a popular camping spot, and that was exactly why I chose it. The map showed a small clearing along a stream, about 5 miles from the nearest trailhead. It looked perfect for a night or two of solitude. I packed lightly but efficiently: a small tent, a sleeping bag, a camp stove, canned food, water, a first aid kit, a headlamp, a compass, and a small folding shovel. I didn't bring much else because I liked moving fast and carrying everything on my back. The morning was clear and crisp when I parked at the trailhead. The air had that freshness that made you take a deep breath and feel like your lungs were expanding. And the forest smelled like earth and damp leaves. I hoisted my pack and started walking, the crunch of dried pine needles beneath my boots keeping a steady rhythm. The first 2 miles were easy. The trail was wide and well-trodden, the occasional bird flitting overhead. Sunlight filtered through the branches in shafts, making patterns on the ground. I felt good, energized. But after the second mile, the trail narrowed. The undergrowth thickened and I had to duck under branches, step over fallen logs, and carefully watch my footing over roots and moss-covered rocks. The forest was quiet now, apart from the rustle of wind in the treetops and the distant call of a hawk. I felt my heart pick up a little, not from fear, just from the thrill of being so deep in the woods. By late afternoon, I reached the clearing. It was smaller than I imagined, maybe 30 feet across, with a flat patch of grass surrounded by tall trees and dense brush. A shallow stream cut through one side of it, moving quickly over rocks. I dropped my pack and took it all in. It was perfect. No signs of other campers, no trash, nothing but the smell of wet earth and the sound of the water. I set up my tent near the stream, carefully picking a spot that was flat but slightly elevated just in case it rained. I cleared some rocks and sticks, laid my sleeping pad inside, and unrolled my sleeping bag. As I worked, I noticed something odd. Along the edge of the clearing, where the brush was thick, I could see faint tracks in the soft soil. They were too small for a deer, but they weren't human either. They looked like footprints, maybe 4 or 5 inches across with long, narrow toes. I froze and stared for a moment. My first thought was coyote or fox, but the shape was wrong. The prints didn't match anything I knew. I took a few photos and marked the location in my compass app, but I didn't dwell on it. Animals make tracks all the time. Maybe someone had come here recently and brought some kind of trap for hunting. My mind tried to rationalize it, even as a tiny knot of unease formed in my stomach. I decided to collect firewood before it got too dark. I went down to the stream and grabbed dry branches and small logs, testing each one to make sure it wasn't damp. By the time the sun was low in the sky, I had a decent pile of wood. I sat on a large rock near the water, built a small fire, and cooked my dinner. A can of chili heated over my portable stove. The smell of cooking food mixed with the smoke from the fire, and the forest seemed alive in the golden light of dusk. Birds had gone quiet, replaced by crickets and the occasional splash of a fish in the stream. After eating, I cleaned up and put everything back in my pack. I wanted to explore a little before dark, so I walked along the stream. The water ran clear and cold over smooth rocks. The forest was beautiful, but now the shadows were long and dark, and every rustle of leaves made me start. That's when I noticed movement at the edge of the clearing. I stopped immediately. A dark shape low to the ground, slipping behind the brush. My heart rate jumped. My first instinct was that it was an animal, probably a coyote or a bobcat. But there was something about the way it moved. Silent, deliberate. It paused, watched me, then disappeared. I decided to head back to the tent quickly. By the time I was there, the sun had set. I lit a larger fire and sat close to it, keeping my eyes on the brush. My ears strained to catch every sound. The crack of a branch, the splash in the stream, the rustle of leaves. I told myself it was an animal, maybe curious, maybe hunting. But as the darkness deepened, I realized the prints I had seen earlier weren't getting any further explanation. My stomach tightened. Something about this spot didn't feel right anymore. I tried to sleep. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the small tent ceiling, listening to the stream and the forest. But every time I drifted off, a snap of a twig or a rustle outside made me jerk awake. Hours passed like this. At some point, the fire burned low, leaving just a few glowing embers. That's when I saw it clearly. A shadow moving along the edge of the clearing, a dark, low shape. I couldn't identify it at first, but I could see it watching the fire. And for the first time, I realized it wasn't moving like a normal animal. It was deliberate, patient, and quiet. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. I reached slowly for my flashlight and shone it toward the movement. Nothing, just the trees and the underbrush. My mind raced. I was alone deep in the forest with something or someone watching me. I tried to reason. Maybe it was a hunter, maybe a poacher, maybe someone camping illegally. But the feeling of being hunted myself, being watched, made me sick with fear. I decided then that I couldn't stay in that clearing. I packed my gear as quietly as I could, making sure nothing rattled or made noise. I kept my flashlight ready, scanning the perimeter constantly. The shadow never reappeared. But I had the unmistakable feeling that it was still there, waiting. Once everything was packed, I waited until a moment when the forest seemed quiet and I slipped into the trees, heading back toward the trailhead. I kept moving fast, but careful not to trip. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me tense. The forest felt different at night. Shapes that were harmless in the daylight became menacing. My flashlight beam bounced over trees and rocks, creating long, jagged shadows. I stayed close to the stream, thinking it might give me some orientation, but soon the path vanished under thick brush. I realized I had lost the trail entirely. Panic started to set in. I tried to calm myself, remembered the compass, and worked out the direction to the trailhead. I moved cautiously, but faster now, the fear pushing me forward. At some point, I stumbled over a root and fell hard. My knee bled, my elbow scraped, and I cursed under my breath. The pain was sharp, but it kept me alert. I got up, wiped the blood on my pants, and kept moving. Hours passed. My flashlight battery started to die. I rationed it, using it only to check the ground immediately in front of me. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear mixed together. But I kept telling myself, just get to the trailhead. Just get to safety. Then around 2 a.m. I heard it, a soft, deliberate crunching of leaves somewhere behind me. I froze, not an animal. This was too heavy, too precise. Something human. My heart raced, my chest felt tight. I had no weapon, just the small camping knife in my belt. And I realized I needed to stay silent and keep moving. I took a deep breath and ran. Not sprinting, not recklessly, but a controlled, fast run toward the direction I believed the trailhead was. The crunching followed, always behind me, sometimes to my left, sometimes to my right. By the time I saw the faint lights of a distant road, I could barely stand. My legs burned, my lungs ached, and my body was covered in scratches and mud. But the lights meant I had made it out of the forest. I stumbled toward the road, waving my hands, and a car appeared. I shouted until someone stopped, and I collapsed into the seat. The driver called the authorities, and I gave them the location and a description. They searched the area extensively the next day, but found no one. No tracks, no signs of anyone hiding nearby. Just my footprints and the strange small prints I had seen earlier. I never returned to that part of the forest. I've gone camping many times since, but I stick to well-known trails and populated areas. I never stopped loving the outdoors, but that night taught me how fragile solitude can be. The forest is beautiful, but it can also hide dangers we can't always explain. Sometimes the scariest moments come from the knowledge that someone or something is out there, watching, waiting, patient, while you are completely alone. And when I lie in my own bed now, I can still remember the sound of those deliberate steps following me through the night. And it reminds me that some parts of the world, no matter how peaceful they look in daylight, are better respected from a distance. The experience left me shaken, yes, but also grateful. I survived because I stayed calm under fear, because I prepared properly, because I respected the wilderness and its hidden dangers. And while I will always carry a memory of that shadow moving in the dark, I also carry the knowledge that caution, awareness, and persistence can see you through situations that seem impossible to survive. That night I learned the forest doesn't need ghosts to be terrifying. It can terrify you all on its own, through silent shadows and the simple, relentless presence of someone or something else sharing your space. I had always been drawn to the solitude of the forest, the idea of escaping the noise of the city. Disconnecting from the digital world and immersing myself in nature was something I cherished. So when I decided to go camping alone in the remote pines of the Adirondacks, I thought it would be the perfect way to recharge. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, the sun just beginning to filter through the trees. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. I packed my gear, checked my map, and set off on the trail, eager for the solitude that awaited me. The first day was uneventful. I hiked for miles, enjoying the peace and quiet, stopping occasionally to take in the scenery or snap a photo. As evening approached, I found a secluded spot near a small stream and set up camp. The fire crackled as I cooked my meal, and the stars began to emerge in the clear night sky. It was everything I had hoped for, but as the night wore on, I began to feel uneasy. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming during the day, now felt oppressive. The wind whispered through the trees, and every snap of a twig made me jump. I told myself it was just the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint rustling in the underbrush. At first, I thought it was an animal, perhaps a deer or a raccoon. But then it came again, closer this time. My heart raced. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the darkness, but saw nothing. The rustling stopped. I sat there frozen, listening to the silence that followed. I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, I was alone in the woods, and the mind can be a powerful thing. I tried to shake off the feeling and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the tent, every distant hoot of an owl, kept me on edge. The next morning, I packed up camp and continued on the trail, eager to put the unease of the previous night behind me. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. By the time I reached my next campsite, I was exhausted and on edge. I set up my tent quickly and tried to focus on the task at hand. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. I heard footsteps in the distance, slow and deliberate. I froze, listening intently. They stopped. Then, after a long pause, they started again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the area. There was no one there, but the footsteps continued, circling my campsite. My breath caught in my throat. I was not alone. I spent the rest of the night with my back to the fire, eyes darting to every movement in the darkness. The footsteps never stopped, always just beyond the reach of my light. I didn't sleep a wink. The next morning, I packed up and left the campsite early, my nerves frayed. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to the trailhead. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. Every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I quickened my pace, eager to reach the safety of the trailhead. When I finally arrived, I was relieved to see my car still parked where I had left it. I threw my gear into the trunk and drove away, not looking back. As I left the forest behind, I couldn't help but wonder who or what had been watching me. I had been wanting to get away from people for a while. Not because of anything dramatic, just because I was tired of hearing the same voices every day, sitting in the same rooms, looking at screens all the time. I wanted to be somewhere quiet. Somewhere where the loudest sound was wind or water. I'd done small camping trips before, but always at popular spots. This time I wanted something different, something isolated. So, on a Friday morning in late September, I loaded up my old SUV with gear, a small cooler and a backpack full of essentials, and I headed north. The place I chose wasn't a marked campground. It was part of a large forest preserve that stretched for miles, crossed with dirt access roads used by logging trucks. I had seen on a map that one of those dirt roads went deep enough to reach a small lake with no nearby houses or campgrounds. That was where I planned to stay. Just a few days to fish a little, clear my head, and sleep away from the hum of everything. The drive was long and empty. After the last gas station, I didn't see another car for nearly an hour. The road turned into rough dirt full of potholes, and dust kicked up behind me so thick I could barely see in the rearview mirror. The forest pressed in on both sides, tall pines and dense brush, the kind that blocks all sunlight near the ground. I had to drive slowly to avoid bottoming out, and it felt like I was moving deeper into a world that had forgotten people existed. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was low. The road ended in a clearing that opened right up to the water. The lake was small and still, surrounded by trees with only a thin strip of rocky shore. No sign of anyone. No trash, no fire pits, not even footprints. Perfect. I parked near the tree line, turned off the engine, and stepped out. The silence was heavier than I expected. Just the sound of insects and distant wind brushing through leaves. The air smelled like pine needles and damp soil. I unpacked slowly, stretching from the drive. I set my tent on a small rise above the lake so it wouldn't flood if it rained. The ground was soft but uneven, full of roots, and it took longer than usual to get the stakes in. By the time I finished, my shirt was sticking to my back with sweat. The sun was gone behind the trees and the air turned cool almost instantly. I set up a small campfire near the shore and cooked a simple meal. Just some canned beans and a sausage over the flames. The firelight flickered on the trees, making the shadows shift. I remember thinking how different they looked when you're completely alone. How alive the woods seem when there's no sound of cars or voices. That night I sat for a long time just listening to the forest. The fire popped quietly, and every now and then a fish would splash somewhere out on the lake. I felt calm, maybe more calm than I'd felt in years. When I finally crawled into the tent, the temperature had dropped even more, and the ground was hard despite my sleeping mat. I zipped the tent shut, wrapped my sleeping bag tight, and stared up at the dim outline of the tent ceiling until I drifted off. I woke up sometime after midnight. At first I didn't know why. There wasn't any sound, and at least not right away. Then I heard something faint, like a snapping branch, somewhere behind the tent. It was quiet, just one or two cracks, then nothing. I lay still, listening. Probably an animal, I thought. A raccoon or deer. The forest is full of that kind of noise at night. But there was something about the stillness afterward that made me stay awake. Usually when animals move, there's a rhythm. Footsteps, rustling, consistent sounds. This was just one or two noises, then complete silence. I waited, barely breathing, but it didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and fell back asleep. The next morning, everything looked normal. I made coffee on the little gas burner and looked around the camp. Nothing seemed disturbed. I walked around behind the tent where I thought I'd heard the noise, and I did see a few small branches broken on the ground, but that could have been from wind. Still, I felt a strange awareness, like I was being watched. I tried to ignore it and spent most of the morning fishing off the shore. The lake was calm, and I caught a small perch within 20 minutes. I released it. It wasn't about catching fish, it was just the quiet that I wanted. By afternoon, I decided to explore a bit. There was a faint path leading away from the clearing into the woods, maybe used long ago by hunters. I took a bottle of water and followed it. The path climbed uphill slightly and curved deeper between thick trees. The ground was covered in dry needles that muffled every step. After about half a mile, the trees opened up into a small clearing. In the middle was an old, rusted metal barrel half buried in the dirt. It looked like it had been used for burning trash years ago. There were bits of melted plastic and charred glass inside. Someone had been here once, but not recently. Everything around it was overgrown. I didn't stay long. The air felt different there, heavier, stiller, almost like the sound of the forest didn't reach that spot. I turned back toward camp, feeling slightly uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. The path seemed darker on the way back, like the trees had closed in tighter. When I reached camp again, I felt a rush of relief, even though I didn't know what exactly I'd been afraid of. That night was colder. I built a bigger fire and sat closer to it. The forest around the camp seemed louder, not with animals, but with the absence of them. I realized at one point that I hadn't heard any birds since late afternoon, not even crickets after dusk. The air was completely still. Around 9, I went into the tent and zipped it up tight again. I was tired but restless. My flashlight was beside me and I kept reaching for it even though there was no reason to. At some point I heard the sound again, that faint crack of something stepping on a branch. This time it wasn't far behind the tent. My body froze. The sound came again, slow and irregular, like someone trying to move quietly but stepping on the wrong spots. I turned off my breathing for a second just to hear better. Another step, then another. The tent fabric was thin, and I could almost sense the movement outside it, like weight shifting in the dark. I grabbed the flashlight and turned it on, shining it toward the back of the tent. The light pushed through the fabric, lighting it up faintly from inside. I didn't see any shadow or outline, but the sound stopped. Completely. I waited for several minutes. Nothing. Just the distant sound of water lapping on the shore. I finally turned off the light and lay there staring at the darkness, not daring to move. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning I checked around the tent again. This time I found something that made my stomach twist. Not tracks exactly, but a spot of flattened grass near the back, like someone or something had stood there for a while. It wasn't big enough to be a bear or deer. The indentation looked more like the shape of a human boot. Not fresh enough to be clear, but the outline was there. I stared at it for a long time. I told myself it could have been my own, maybe from when I set up the tent, but I knew it wasn't. I had walked from the other side. The thought of someone else being out there with me unseen made the air feel colder. I decided to stay alert, but not panic. Maybe it was just a hiker passing through. Maybe they saw my firelight the night before and were curious. Still, I didn't like that they hadn't called out or come closer. I went on with the day, but everything I did, on fetching water, cooking lunch, even walking to the lake, felt watched. The woods didn't feel the same anymore. Every time the wind moved the branches, I flinched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something, but there was never anything there. I tried to shake it off, to not give in to that paranoid feeling, but it clung to me. Late afternoon, I decided to check that old clearing again. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted proof that it was just me out here. I followed the path back, slower this time, scanning everything. When I reached the clearing, the rusted barrel was still there, but something new caught my eye. Fresh tracks in the dirt. They weren't deep, but they were clearly recent. Boot prints, definitely human. They led toward the trees and disappeared into the brush opposite the path I came from. I stood there staring, my chest tightening. Someone had been here since yesterday. Someone with real boots, not an animal. I thought about calling out, but my voice felt stuck in my throat. Instead, I crouched, studying the prints. They were smaller than mine, maybe a size down, the tread still sharp. There were maybe 6 or 7 steps visible before they vanished into the undergrowth. I listened, waiting, but heard nothing, and not even wind. When I finally turned back toward camp, I moved quickly, constantly looking over my shoulder. I could feel the weight of being watched, though I didn't see anyone. The forest suddenly felt endless, every tree like a wall, every shadow like a doorway where something might be standing. My heartbeat didn't slow until I saw the shimmer of the lake through the trees again. That night, I made the fire bigger than usual. I dragged some fallen branches around to make it look like I had a sort of perimeter. I knew it wouldn't actually help, but it made me feel better. I ate quickly, then sat by the fire with the flashlight in my hand. I kept it off most of the time, saving the batteries, but I clicked it on whenever I thought I heard something. Around midnight, I finally lay down, though I didn't expect to sleep. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke to the sound of something clinking, a faint metallic noise like metal hitting metal. It's I had planned this camping trip for months. The idea of disappearing into the woods for a few days, away from the constant hum of city life, sounded perfect. I was exhausted from work and life, and the thought of nothing but trees, dirt, and the occasional bird song was almost intoxicating. I packed my car the night before with precision, loading my tent, sleeping bag, stove, extra clothes, and plenty of food and water. I had even bought a new flashlight, headlamp, and a handheld lantern just in case. I told myself I was being careful, but part of me knew I had a streak of recklessness that came alive in situations like this. I left early in the morning, before the sun had even fully risen. The drive out of the city was slow, traffic thick with people going about their lives, unaware that I was heading toward nothing. By the time I reached the forest, the sun was a soft golden haze through the mist of the morning. The smell of damp earth hit me immediately, that sharp raw scent that only appears when the air is heavy with moisture and trees. I parked my car at the edge of a small dirt path that led deeper into the woods. I had chosen this spot because it was off the main trails. The forest here was dense, the trees old and thick, their trunks scarred and rough. The ground was uneven, covered in fallen leaves, branches, and the occasional moss-covered rock. It wasn't a tourist trail. There were no signs, no maps, no easy way to know where you were. That was part of the appeal. I strapped on my backpack, adjusted my tent bag, and started walking. The forest swallowed the light quickly. Even though it was early, the tall trees and thick canopy made it feel like late afternoon. I followed an old game trail that zigzagged between trees, careful to avoid roots and loose rocks. My boots crunched against the leaves, a sound that echoed faintly in the quiet of the woods. After about an hour of walking, I found a small clearing. It wasn't large, maybe 20 feet across, but it was flat, and that was enough. I could see the trees surrounding it on all sides, the ground dry except for a few damp patches where the sun hadn't reached. I set up my tent first. It was a small one-person tent, Not much more than a nylon cocoon with poles, but it would be enough. I hammered the stakes into the ground, unrolled my sleeping bag, and arranged my supplies inside. I hung my lantern from a tree branch just outside the tent so I could see if I needed to leave the tent at night. Everything felt fine, normal. It was peaceful. Almost too peaceful. I decided to take a short walk before setting up the rest of my campsite. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds, the occasional rustle of a squirrel in the underbrush, and the distant hum of a creek. I followed the sound of the water and found a narrow stream cutting through the trees. The water was clear and cold, running over rocks and fallen branches. I knelt down, splashed my face, and drank some. The freshness of it made me feel alive. I sat on a rock for a while, just listening to the forest, feeling a kind of calm I hadn't experienced in years. When I returned to my clearing, I started a small fire. I had brought dry kindling and firewood I had collected along the trail, and soon the flames were licking the night air. The firelight cast long, moving shadows on the trees, making them seem alive in a different way than during the day. I cooked some food over the fire, just simple things, canned beans and bread, but it felt luxurious out here. Eating alone in the woods, the smell of smoke mixing with the smell of earth, it felt like I had finally stepped out of the world entirely. As night fell, the forest changed. The sounds of the day faded, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. The temperature dropped quickly and I zipped up my sleeping bag and lantern, keeping the fire alive a little longer before finally letting it die down. I went to sleep with the usual comforting hum of nature around me, but around midnight I woke to a strange sound. At first I wasn't sure what it was. It wasn't the usual rustling of small animals. It was heavier, deliberate, slow steps through the underbrush. My first instinct was to dismiss it, tell myself it was just a deer or some other animal moving through the forest. But then I realized the steps were rhythmic, consistent, not hurried. I had a sudden sinking feeling that it wasn't an animal. I sat up, straining my eyes in the darkness. The lantern outside my tent had burned out, leaving only the moonlight filtering through the canopy. The steps moved closer. Then, very faintly, I heard a snap, a branch breaking, probably under the weight of someone walking. My heart started pounding. I had always told myself that I was prepared for anything in the wilderness, but this felt different. It felt like being watched in a place I thought was completely alone. I didn't move at first. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Then I remembered my flashlight in the tent. I grabbed it, switched it on, and shone it toward the edge of the clearing. Nothing, just the dark silhouettes of the trees. I listened. The sound hadn't stopped. It was closer now, and I could hear the crunch of leaves more clearly. My stomach churned, and I realized I hadn't eaten the adrenaline yet. I needed to think fast. The first thing I did was quietly gather my essentials: backpack, water, small knife, my phone, even though the signal was probably non-existent. I didn't want to be stuck if whoever or whatever was out there came closer. I left the tent mostly packed and slowly moved toward my car, hoping to get there without being noticed. Every step on the leaves seemed impossibly loud. My breathing was shallow, but I tried to keep it quiet. I reached the edge of the clearing and stopped. The sounds were all around me now. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. Whoever it was wasn't moving in a straight line. They were circling methodically, maybe looking for something. My mind raced. I thought about trying to run, but the forest floor was uneven, full of roots and rocks. If I tripped, I would be done. I decided to keep moving slowly, trying to stick to the shadows, hugging the trees as much as possible. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the old trail where I had parked. I ducked behind a thick oak and peered toward my car. I could see it dimly lit by the moonlight, and my heart leapt. But then I saw movement near the car. A tall figure hunched slightly, moving toward it. I froze. The person, or animal-shaped human, was rummaging around my car, checking the doors. I realized then that they had probably been following me from the trailhead, watching as I walked into the forest. I had to think fast. There was no cell signal and no one around for miles. I couldn't make a fire, couldn't make noise. My only option was to get into the car quietly and drive. I waited until the figure moved away from the driver's side. Then I sprinted. Every step felt like a drum in my chest, my boots slapping the earth as hard as I could. I reached the car, unlocked it, and threw myself inside. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. The figure looked up as I drove off. I didn't wait to see more. I floored the gas, tearing down the trail toward the main road, swerving around roots and rocks. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, and every shadow made me flinch. I didn't stop until I reached the paved road and saw the dim glow of streetlights in the distance. Once I was back in civilization, I tried to make sense of what had happened. The police took my statement the next day. They told me that the area I had camped in was known for occasional encounters with illegal campers and, sometimes, people living off the land who would follow hikers to take supplies. They said I had been lucky, that whoever had followed me didn't intend to hurt me, just to steal food or equipment. The thought didn't calm me. Luck or not, I had come dangerously close to something that could have ended badly. After that trip, I never camped alone again. I started going with friends, or at least with someone I could trust. I always carried a fully charged phone, extra lighting, and stayed on marked trails. I didn't stop loving the woods. They were still peaceful, still beautiful. But I learned the hard way that peace can be deceptive. Silence can hide danger, and the kind of horror that comes from real life, not from stories, can sneak up on you when you least expect it. That trip stayed with me for years. Every time I hear a snap of a branch in the forest, every time I see a shadow move in the dark, I remember that night. I learned to respect the forest differently, not just for its beauty, but for its unpredictability. Nature doesn't care about plans, and it certainly doesn't care about human confidence. It teaches through experience, and my lesson had been harsh but real. I never went back to that exact trail. I never wanted to, but I continued to camp, continued to explore, continued to test myself. The fear never completely left me, but it became a companion, a reminder that I could survive, and that sometimes survival isn't about courage, but about awareness, preparation, and listening to the smallest signs of danger. That night, I had almost been careless, almost thought I was untouchable. I wasn't. And that was the clearest, most valuable lesson I ever learned in the woods.